Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Book 3. 1. Charlie Harmondy sat on a cold stone block beneath a gray sky and held a torn piece of his shirt to the bleeding wound on the side of his head as he tried to decide what he should do. Tall stone pillars, cracked and worn, surrounded the ring of brittle grass where the stone block sat. Beyond that, all he could see was more rubble. This was not what he had expected, though perhaps he should have. No one had seen the city of magic, said to be the birthplace of the elves, in 1,000 years. A tumbled-down ruin should not be so shocking. Anton had told him this was where he would find what he sought, and he had no reason to doubt the man. He glanced at the silver disc clutched in his left hand. It was covered in strange markings he couldn't read, and in its center was a small, white magestone. A dead magestone. Or maybe just a very weak one. Charlie wasn't sure. It had served its purpose in bringing him here, and, as unexpected and depressing as his dismal surroundings were, Charlie knew this was the right place. The dragon in his mind recognized it. Still, he was hesitant to throw the disc away until he was sure there was no further use for it. The map and the key was what Lily had called it. So until he had found the silver catacombs and freed the sleeping magic therein, he thought he would hold on to it. But at the moment his main concern was his head, which throbbed with a dull, steady ache. No surprise really, considering he'd just been pummeled by a heavy piece of machinery. But its continued bleeding worried him. Then, of course, there was the fact that he was utterly alone in a strange place with no idea what had become of his friends. If the big magestone in the castle basement had brought only him here and left the others behind, they were in far more danger than he was, and there was nothing he could do to help them. Charlie slipped the disc into the pocket of his jeans and slid down off the block. Sitting here was doing him no good. He needed forward motion to continue his search. Only he wasn't sure where to begin. All he had to go on was a recurring dream of a little valley nestled between two hills. He could see no sign of any hills from where he stood. But he supposed for the disc to have dropped him off at the catacombs. Front door was too much to hope. He only wished he knew why he had been brought to this particular spot when it was so obvious nothing was here. Charlie struck out along what might once have been a narrow road, now choked with scrub grass and littered with small bits of stone. The silence echoed around him, broken only by the thin cry of the chill wind. He shivered. Not since his father died and he had been taken to live at the home had he felt so completely alone. He worried about the others. Especially Thomas, who had been in bad shape when last Charlie saw him. He wasn't sure he should care, even though the older boy had saved his life and, more importantly, Miranda's life. Two things for which Charlie was most grateful. Only he wasn't sure they were enough to negate all the bad things Thomas had done. Thomas had always been his worst enemy, his tormentor. Had even tried to kill him once, not so long ago. He was a traitor several times over and people had died for his treachery. Yet now they were uneasy allies. But if Charlie had learned one thing since being dragged away from the home, it was that with Thomas there were never any guarantees. Charlie walked until the throbbing in his head became so fierce he had to stop. He sat in the shade of a tall pillar, the top half of which had broken off and fallen to the side. Ignoring the cold bite of the stone through his thin t-shirt, Charlie leaned back and closed his eyes. Maybe he would sleep for a while and dream something useful. An elf knelt beside a glittering pool of water beneath the drooping branches of a willow tree. A great rushing sound filled the air. The elf looked up, his pale blue eyes clear and unafraid. A dragon landed on the other side of the pool. A great green dragon whose scales glittered like emeralds in the sunlight. "Little one," the dragon said, "your time has come. I pass my mantle on to you, as it was passed to me once, long, long ago. I will sleep the dreamless sleep for all eternity. Go, and give my gift to the elves of this one's world so it may not be lost. And remember, little one, all worlds belong to you to tend and care for. Meddle not in trifling affairs, but only when great tragedy looms. I understand. The elf stood. I fear not my death. For I know it was for this moment I was born. The green dragon's scales began to glimmer with an iridescent light. It washed over the elf, then the dragon was gone. The elf stepped from under the tree and tilted his head back to feel the warmth of the sun on his face. He smiled and raised his arms. In his place, a white dragon spread its wings and leapt into the sky. Charlie opened his eyes, at first uncertain of what had woken him. The dream faded even as he sat up. But was it a dream? It had the odd feel of memory to it. Though not a memory of his own. Because his magic was no longer a separate thing but fully part of him, Charlie picked up the faint sound without even consciously trying. The slight tumble of stone against stone. A crunch. The steady, though barely discernible, tread of feet. The sound of someone's trying to move stealthily through the ruins. It wasn't his friends, he was sure. Maybe Raven could move so quietly, but not the others. Slowly, he stood. It sounded as if the footsteps were moving in his direction. He could only see three choices: stay here and wait for whoever it was to slip up on him, run and risk having an enemy at his back, or move toward whoever it was and perhaps catch them off guard. He chose the third option. With the aid of his magic, Charlie's moves were quick and silent. So silent, whoever was creeping up on him could not possibly hear him. A soft scuff sounded and Charlie ducked behind a fallen pillar as a shadowhound came up over the top of the rubble ahead. It looked like a tall, slender, black dog with pointed ears. Only it was a little hazy around the edges, like a smeared charcoal drawing. Its glowing red eyes scanned the area before it. Charlie had come across the creatures twice before, the first time while breaking into the school record room, when the shadowhound would surely have killed him if not for his sprite friend spree, and the second time in the castle basement, when two of the creatures had helped to save his life and the lives of his friends. It was up in the air what this one might decide to do. The hound's narrow head turned in Charlie's direction. Their eyes met. With a heavy feeling in his gut, Charlie came out from behind the pillar. Even with his magic he could not outpace a hound. He wasn't sure he could come out on top in a fight with one either, but he had to try. The dragon in his mind stirred as the magic in his veins began to burn. The hound made no move toward him, but continued to stare with its direct, unblinking gaze. Then it sat, cocking its head to one side and looking more like a dog than ever. It was responding to his magic, just as the two in the castle had. Charlie eased slowly forward, watching for any sign the hound might attack. The crunch of a booted foot on stone reminded Charlie there were others nearby. He stopped and silently admonished himself for letting the sight of the shadowhound make him forget the other sounds. A man came up on the pile of rubble behind the hound. Or, to be more precise, an elf with long silver hair tied back in a braid. He wore a skin-tight uniform of black and gold, and in his hand held a slender, blue rod. There was something vaguely familiar about him. He spoke in a language Charlie did not recognize. The end of the sentence lifted in the lilt of a question as he raised the rod. Charlie had no idea what that thing could do, but he'd had enough weapons pointed at him to get the idea. He raised his hands in what he hoped was the universal sign of "I'm not armed, please don't shoot me," and smiled in his most non-threatening manner. "I don't understand you." The elf's eyes narrowed. Then he turned and called out to someone behind him. A moment later another elf, this one with loose shoulder-length hair also of silver, came up beside the first elf. It was then Charlie realized why these elves looked so familiar. They had the same coloring as Sylvan, the leader of the elven resistance movement back in Kiloreen. The second elf gave the first a necklace made of small, red mage stones. When the first elf put the necklace on, the stones began to glow. "What are you?" he asked. "I'm Charlie." "But, I bet that's not what you meant." He supposed this man wanted some kind of explanation as to what he was doing here, and Charlie was not sure how much he should tell. By this time, the dream had faded away in his mind. The memory of a memory. I am Mish of the Undine. You are not Undine. You are not Solari. You are not elfkind. What are you? That could prove difficult to explain. If these elves had never seen a human, it stood to reason they wouldn't understand the word elf blood. Not that Charlie resembled an elf blood, except for being a bit slighter of frame than most 14-year-old boys. I'm human, mostly, but I do have elven ancestors. Where I come from, they call me elf blood. I do not know these words, human, elf blood. You do not look elven. Where are you from, Dot? It's called Angland, but no, you probably never heard of that either. He wished Grant was here. He was so much better at explaining things. I came from, I don't know, another world, maybe? A magestone brought me here. Look, I don't have a weapon, so could I lower my arms? This was not technically true, as his magic was certainly a kind of weapon. But he didn't want to reveal too much too soon. Mish gave him a curt nod, then slipped the rod into a loop on the side of his uniform. He touched a hand to the stones and they dimmed as he turned to say something in his own language. Half a dozen elves, all identical to Charlie's eyes, came around the side of the rubble. Mish, the second elf, and the Shadowhound climbed down to join them. Mish lowered his hand and the stones began to glow again. It is written in the scrolls of Banastor that a day will come when the lost magic must be found again. On that day, a strange creature will come from the old world. A creature who will be elfkind and yet not. And he will have with him the disc that opens the lock on the silver catacombs. Do you have such a disc? Are you the one for whom we have waited so long? Charlie knew if Grant was here he would counsel caution. But he wasn't, and Charlie was so glad to find someone who might be able to lead him to the catacombs that he threw all caution to the wind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the disc. I've come to find the magic. The others murmured among themselves until a lifted hand from Mish silenced them. It is good you have come, Charlie of Angland. The void has pressed close and we had little hope of holding it at bay much longer. You are a most welcome sight. So are you. Charlie's heart beat faster at the thought that he might be so close to what he sought. The dragon in his mind stirred. Do you know where the catacombs are? No. The scrolls do not say. And if ever the Undine knew, that knowledge has passed from us. Charlie's heart fell. Oh. Maybe you can help anyway. There's a valley between two hills. A valley with a waterfall, and a brook, and a cave. Mish shook his head. There is no such place in the city. What about beyond the city? There is no beyond. His expression grew grim. There is only the city in the void, a great darkness that surrounds us, creeping closer and closer. Much of the city is gone and much is like this, reduced to nothing but rubble. What is left is split in two. Half belonging to the Undine, half belonging to the Solari. Perhaps they may know where the catacombs lie. Then could you take me to them, or at least point the way? Maybe all hope was not lost after all. I cannot. The Solari are our sworn enemies. They worship the void and the foul things that haunt its darkness. If you go to them, they will kill you. Yeah, that sounded about right considering the kind of luck he'd had so far on this crazy quest. So what do I do now? He hadn't really been asking the elf, just the universe in general. Come with us, Mish said. We will hide you from the Solari and seek a way to find the location of the catacombs. The magic is lost, but if you are here, it seeks to be found. Perhaps now we may do what our ancestors could not. There wasn't much else he could see to do. All right. I'll come. But I don't suppose you've seen any other strangers around, have you? There are others with you? Maybe. I'm not sure. There were others with me before the Magestone brought me here, but I don't know what happened to them. Perhaps the void somehow interfered with the stone's magic, Mish said. Once we have returned to the compound, I will spread word for my people to be easy on any strangers they come across and to bring them to me. Thank you. Charlie fell in beside Mish and the hound as they went around the pile of rubble to where the road continued. The other elves followed behind. Charlie only hoped his friends were here. He wasn't sure he could really concentrate on anything else until he was certain they were safe. 2. Thomas Lanier lay on his back and stared up at the gray sky. The cold ground chilled his skin. Or at least it felt cold to him. Between the aftereffects of the drugs and the gunshot wound, he'd lost a lot of blood. How are you feeling? Raven Marks looked down at him. There was not much real concern behind the question. Wonderful. Of all the people he could have gotten stuck with, why did it have to be this brassy, obnoxious elf-blood? Why not Miranda? Or even Charlie, for that matter. He had no manner of luck at all. Raven crouched down beside him, her blue eyes intent on his face. You don't look wonderful. She pushed a tangle of black curls, highlighted purple, behind one slender pointed ear, then checked the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. You're lucky the bullet went clean through. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. How lucky I am. He closed his eyes and wished she would just go away and let him die in peace. We should try and find the others. She stood. I don't like to be separated in this strange place. Go ahead, then. I like it fine right where I am. Thomas didn't relish the idea of dying, but if it was going to happen, this was as good a place as any. I can't leave you here. Thomas opened one eye. Why not, Dot? Because you'd probably go and die and Charlie would never forgive me. Though I can't imagine what his attachment is to you. It's my sparkling wit. He sat up with a low moan. Draws people like flies. Really? 'Cause I can think of something else that draws flies. She gave him a skeptical look. Can you even get on your feet? Thomas scowled up at her. He had to admit, if only to himself, the view was not bad. She filled out her black tank top and jeans in all the right places, and her face wasn't bad either. He could see how Charlie Boy would be attracted. Too bad she was a pain in the ass and an elf blood to boot. Give me a minute, will you? I'm not exactly in top shape, Dot. Just how much blood could a person lose without dying, or at least passing out? Thomas didn't know, but apparently he'd not reached that point yet. Between the blood loss and the strain of his mental battle with Duncan, he felt like he should have passed out hours ago. Can you contact Charlie? You know, in your head? No, he winced as he drew his legs up in preparation to stand. There was no part of his body that didn't hurt. I can't get in Charlie Boy's head without an invitation. Maybe if he thinks about it, he'll give me a ring. After that stunt you pulled back at the castle, I doubt it. Gritting his teeth, Thomas drew in a hissing breath and pushed himself to his feet. For a moment the world spun crazily around him, but somehow he managed to both keep his feet and the contents of his stomach firmly planted. He glared at Raven. Yeah, just stand there. Don't offer to help or anything. I'm fine, thanks. Hey, I was all for leaving you back at the castle. She backed toward the stone block where she'd laid her automatic rifle. I don't trust you as far as I can throw you. And that's not far. Thomas licked his dry lips. I'm not exactly thrilled to be in your company either, but it looks like we're stuck with each other. She hefted the rifle. Can you maybe contact one of the others if you can't get through to Charlie? Do you have any idea how much energy it takes to use a mental ability? A lot. Especially if I can't see where I'm sending. I can barely stand on my feet as it is. He could feel the effect of the drugs wearing off. This was a good thing because it meant he could breathe without coughing up blood. But without the drugs, his telepathy went back to being what it used to be, a fun toy but not of much practical use. Thomas could send mental images and even words, but the kind of two-way talking he'd done with Charlie in the castle was something different. And to actually possess someone else's body, as he had Charlie's, would be to push the limit of what he could do. It was possible the drugs would have some kind of long-term effect on his ability, but he was in no shape to test the possibility now. His stomach cramped, reminding him it had been too long since he'd eaten. One look around the tumbled, gray ruins told him that was not to be remedied anytime soon. Let's get a move on. The sooner we find civilization, the better. For once, I agree with you. Raven led the way down what might have once been a road, but was now little more than a grassy path between piles of stone. Where are we, anyway? Thomas asked. There was a lot about what was going on he didn't know, but he was sure it had something to do with Charlie. Seemed like everything did. Never mind, Raven said. It has nothing to do with you. You're just excess baggage. Thomas glared at the back of her head. If he were stronger, he'd show her who was excess baggage, gun or no gun. But for the moment he needed her, much as it galled him. She would protect him if need be, for Charlie. His lip curled up in an unconscious sneer. Did you hear that? She asked as she came to an abrupt stop. What? He looked where she was looking and saw nothing but more piles of stone. What was it? I'm not sure. It sounded like wait, there it is again. Thomas still heard nothing but the steady whine of the wind, but then he didn't have elf ears. Raven lifted the rifle and her finger hovered over the trigger. He hoped she had the sense not to shoot the first thing she saw on the off chance it was Charlie. The last thing he wanted was to get stuck in this place. If it was Charlie Boy who had gotten them here, it would probably take Charlie Boy to get them out again. Charlie, is that you? Raven called out. Shut up, Thomas said in a strained whisper. What are you trying to do, get us killed? It might be Charlie or one of the others. Yeah, and it might be something else. Raven shook her head. This is a dead city. Are you sure? She hesitated, then checked the gun. 20 rounds left. That should take care of anything hostile. She started in the direction they had been looking. What are you doing? Thomas wasn't exactly a coward, but if something was out there, he wanted to be going in the opposite direction. He was in no condition to protect himself and he wasn't sure how far Raven would go to keep him alive for Charlie. Risk her own life? He doubted it. If the others are out there, I want to get to them, she said. If not, I don't want whatever it was sneaking up on my back. Come to think of it, I don't really like having you back there either. Why don't you go on ahead? Why don't you take a flying leap? Raven smiled. Because I'm the one with the gun. So what are you going to do, shoot me? He laughed. How would you explain that to Charlie Boy? I'd think of something. Unfortunately, he didn't know her well enough to tell whether or not she was bluffing. She handled that gun like she knew how to use it and Thomas decided it was better not to push. For now. So he went on ahead and added that to the list of reasons why he'd like nothing better than to bash her head in. They had walked only a short distance when a woman's voice spoke from somewhere ahead of them. There is no need for your weapon. We are not enemies. Raven and Thomas came to a stop. Who are you? Raven asked. Ezel of the Undine. I can help you find what you seek. And what is it you think I seek? I do not think, I know. You wish to find your friend, Charlie, who seeks the lost magic. Thomas had no idea what the woman was talking about, but judging by the look on Raven's face, she did. It only served to remind him of how little he knew about what was going on. If you're not an enemy, Raven said, show yourself. 4 elves stepped out from behind the rubble ahead. 3 were male and 1 was female. They all had silver hair and eyes and pale skin. They were all dressed in skin-tight black and gold uniforms. The only difference between them, other than gender, was that the woman's hair was longer and braided while the men's was shorter and hung loose. Around the woman's neck was a glowing necklace made of red mage stones. "Welcome to the City of Magic," Ezel said with a smile. "City of Magic, huh?" Thomas snorted. "Doesn't look much like a city of anything to me." Ezel fixed her silver eyes on him. It was a sight more awe-inspiring in the past. "Or so I have been told." "How do you know about Charlie?" Raven asked. "From your mines." Ezel shifted her gaze to Raven. "You will pardon me for prying, I hope, but I had to know who you were. We have waited a long time for someone from the old world to come. I can see neither of you are the one, but you know him and you believe he is here. This is very good news. Can you help us find him?" Raven asked. "Oh, come on," Thomas said. "You want to blindly follow these people just because they're elves? She's a mind reader, she can tell you exactly what you want to hear. Don't be stupid." "My brother, Mish, is leader of the Undine," Ezel said. "If Charlie is here, he will find him." "You aren't seriously listening to this, are you?" Thomas asked. But he could already see she was. For the chance to find Charlie, she'd risk both their lives, and the worst thing was, he wasn't in any shape to do anything about it. "It's worth a shot," Raven said. "Better than wandering around this place by ourselves. I'm going with them. You can do whatever you want. But I'm not leaving you the gun." Thomas scowled. "Suit yourself. But if this turns out to be a horribly bad idea, just remember I told you so." 3. Miranda Cosgrove stood with her hands on her hips and gazed around at the gray rubble. This was the City of Magic, she was sure of it, but it was not what she had expected. How could this have happened? Grant Lanier asked. "How could we have gotten separated like this?" "I don't know. I couldn't see past the mage stone. I think it was blocking me. Can you see anything now?" Miranda took a deep breath to calm herself and closed her eyes. She focused on drawing all her energy to seek out what she desired most. And found nothing. The drugs were wearing off, and if there was any long-term effect to them, she couldn't tell it. Her precognition was returning to what it once was, nothing but vague feelings that sometimes managed to point her in the right direction. For the moment, even they were silent. She opened her eyes and fought back the tears that threatened to fall. "I can't. I'm sorry." "It's okay." Grant pulled her into his arms and held her close. "We'll find him. Somehow." Miranda found she could not speak over the lump in her throat. She thought of Charlie as she had last seen him, so pale and worn, his blonde hair matted with blood. It was so unfair they should have been so briefly reunited only to be torn away from each other again. "Come on." Grant gave her a squeeze. "It's not doing us any good to stand around here. Let's go look for him." Miranda nodded silently. They chose one of the weed-choked paths that wound through the rubble and started to walk. Once Miranda's emotions had calmed enough so she could speak without fear of bursting into tears, she asked, "Do you think Charlie is with the others?" Even if he was with Raven, it would be better than for him to be alone. Though the thought of the two of them together started a burning feeling in her chest. Something had happened between Charlie and Raven in Kiloreen, she had seen it in their eyes. She didn't know what that something was. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. "If not, it doesn't matter," Grant said. "The city can't be that big. I'm sure we'll all be together soon. Besides, Charlie can take care of himself better than any of us." But "Right," Miranda said, though she felt no more confident than he sounded. Yes, Charlie had his magic, but he was never one to do well on his own. Grant's expression grew more serious. "It's Thomas I'm worried about more than any of the others." He looked half dead back at the castle. "Still, I don't know whether to hope he's with Charlie or not." Thomas is stronger than you give him credit for, Miranda said. Most people couldn't have lived through half the things he has. He and Charlie have that much in common, that strength. So do you. It must come from your father. Grant grimaced. I hate to think I got anything from my father. Thomas is much more like him than Charlie and I assure you. I'm not sure I should even care whether Thomas lives or dies after everything he's done. All those people. Their blood is on his hands. Miranda looked away. She could still hear the gunshots, the screams, could still smell the smoke. And not only in her dreams. But the guilt was not his alone. Thomas's betrayal had led the soldiers to their camp, but her hands were not exactly snow white. She had known what was coming and she hadn't said a word. He's done some bad things, she said. A lot of bad things. But it doesn't mean he's a lost cause. I wish I could believe that. Grant sighed. He's still my brother and I still love him, and maybe some of it's my fault. I don't know. I did pick Charlie over him, but it was only because of what Pierce told me. I wanted to make up for the things our father had done. It was stupid. I never meant to hurt Thomas, but I did. It's just that he was so angry after our mother died, so distant. It was like I couldn't reach him anymore. So I stopped trying. It's not your fault, Miranda said. It's not anybody's fault. Nobody forced Thomas to do the things he did. They were his choices. I'm not suggesting anything else. I'm only saying, underneath all the anger and hatred there's another person. A better person. I guess you must see something in him I don't, Grant said. All I know is, back at the home he made a bad habit of preying on those younger and weaker than he was, and he was hardest on Charlie. And that is my fault. No way around it. All my efforts to protect Charlie only made things worse, not better. I can see that now. Thomas hates him. Don't you doubt it for a second. I don't know why he saved Charlie's life back at the castle, but you can bet it had nothing to do with brotherly love. He can't stand the idea of having an elf blood for a brother. Even a half-brother. Miranda couldn't argue with that. Charlie had told her many things about what Thomas was like at the home, and she knew a little herself from the things he used to broadcast out to the class in school. But she had seen a side of Thomas he never had. In the prison camp, when he was sick from the drugs. Scared and in need of a friend. She had tried to be that friend and Thomas had betrayed her. Still, after they broke out of the prison camp and started on their way to King City, she had tried again. Again she was rewarded with betrayal, and this treachery had forced her into a betrayal of her own, and so many had died. Then what did Thomas do but turn around and save Charlie's life when Duncan would have killed him? Maybe Grant was right. Maybe he did have some ulterior motive. Though she couldn't see what it might have been. Weak as he was, Thomas's struggle with Duncan could easily have killed him. Miranda was shocked out of her thoughts when they rounded a corner and found themselves facing a grassy courtyard surrounded by low, rectangular buildings made of stone. Buildings that were entirely intact. A well-worn dirt road lay between them and the courtyard. This road led to the left and right past other buildings further down that, while not exactly ruins, had clearly not been used in a long time. As they approached the road, a creature they had not seen rose up out of the grass. It had the body and feet of a large cat with a mane of gray feathers and a tufted tail, but its face and ears were more like a dog. It regarded them with pupil-less black eyes. "Back away," Grant said. Slowly. Miranda did as he said. But as soon as they started to move, the creature began to growl, its lip lifted in a snarl that revealed long, sharp teeth. They stopped. "What do we do?" Miranda asked. "We could run." Miranda eyed the creature's streamlined body and powerful muscles. "Somehow, I don't think that's a very good idea, but..." "You stay very still," Grant said, "and I'll get it to follow me." "No. I won't let you do that." She didn't know how she would stop him, but she would. He was far more important than she was. His life was worth more. Just then, the door opened on a building to the right and an elf in grey robes came out bearing an armload of scrolls. The sound of him muttering in a strange language was barely audible. He'd gone halfway across the courtyard toward another building before he stopped and slowly turned toward them, his silver eyes going wide. For a moment they stared at each other in silence. Then the elf spoke. The creature sat, still keeping its unblinking gaze on Miranda and Grant. The elf started toward them, hesitated, then strode past the creature and out into the street. He stood looking them up and down while he clutched the scrolls to his chest. Miranda curled her toes self-consciously and wished she had thought to grab her sneakers before she'd turned herself over to the army. The elf said something with the lilt of a question to it. "We don't understand," Grant said. A look of excitement crossed the elf's face. He shifted the scrolls until he had them all held awkwardly in one arm and held up his free hand in what was clearly a stay here motion. Then he turned and hurried back to the building he had come from. "Should we be worried?" Miranda asked. "I don't know. Maybe." But he didn't look upset or scared. He looked... Well, is it just me or did he look excited? I kind of got that impression too. Maybe he can help us, Dot. We're about to find out. The elf hurried toward them. His armload was gone, replaced by a single scroll which he opened before them with a flourish, watching their faces closely. Miranda gasped. There, drawn in black, was the disc Lily had given Charlie at the prison camp. Her reaction seemed to please the elf. A wide grin spread across his face. He pointed at the drawing, then at them. "I think he's asking if we have the disc," Miranda said. "Is it possible they're expecting Charlie?" "Expecting someone with the disc anyway." Grant pointed to the drawing, then at himself and Miranda and shook his head. The elf looked puzzled. "I wish we could explain about Charlie," Grant said. "Thomas's telepathy would be helpful right about now," Miranda said. "He could send the elf a picture, Dot." Grant made a face. "I don't think I'd trust Thomas with something like this. No telling what he might send." Miranda didn't really think that was fair, but kept the opinion to herself. After all, it was really not her place to tell him how to feel about his own brother. "So what do we do?" The elf turned and pointed at a third building set a little back from the others, then raised his eyebrow in question. "I think he wants us to go with him," Grant said. "Should we?" "I don't know. What do you think?" What he was really asking was what did she feel? But for the moment her precognition was being stubbornly silent. He knows about the disc, so he must know about the silver catacombs and the magic. Maybe he could somehow tell us something that would help Charlie. Maybe. Grant looked around with a frown. "I guess we don't have much choice in the matter. But let's be careful, and if you feel anything wrong, you let me know right away." "All right." They followed the elf past the strange creature and across the courtyard toward the building. Miranda only hoped they weren't making a terrible mistake. 4. Charlie and Mish sat in two comfortable chairs in a small room dominated by bookshelves lined with scrolls. Several scrolls lay open on the table between them. Charlie could not read the words written there, as they were in the language of magic. He could only take Mish's word for what they contained. "I am certain you have many questions," Mish said. "But as we knew the moment the disc arrived in the city, so did the Solari. They will be out searching for you. Let us hope they do not find any of your friends before my people do." Charlie did have many questions, but he supposed only one was important at the moment. "Is there anything in any of these scrolls that will help us find the magic?" Mish frowned down at the table. "I have studied the scrolls of Banastor for many years, but I have never read anything to suggest the location of the silver catacombs. There is only this." He laid his hand on one of the scrolls. It says the catacombs lie at the center of all worlds and from them magic flows. Not very helpful, is it? Charlie fingered the disc, which he held in his right hand. No. However, there are scrolls missing and I believe they are in the possession of the Solari. Mish sat back in his chair. We were one people, once. A very long time ago. But with the use of ancient scrolls some of our people found a way to connect to the void and began to practice dark magic. It gave them powers far beyond other elves. They opened the way for terrible monsters to escape from the void, and a great war followed. A war that would surely have consumed the old world in flames had the magic not wrenched the city free and pushed it into the void. This was our punishment. Mish looked down at his hands in his lap. Many of our people died during the war, and many were left in the old world after. Those of us who are here, who remain in the city, are the descendants of those who first used the dark magic. After the war, some of our people realized what they had done and they sought to make repentance. Others chose to remain on the dark path. Thus were the Solari and the Undine born. And the Solari know the location of the catacombs. Charlie said. If any do, yes. But they cannot go there. Only the one with warrior magic can use the disc. He lifted his gaze to meet Charlie's. Only you can free the magic. So everybody keeps telling me. Is there any way we could get someone inside the Solari stronghold? Maybe we could steal the scrolls. It would not be impossible, Mish said. But there may be hundreds of scrolls there and they would all have to be looked through to find the proper one. It would take too much time, I fear, for their stronghold is protected by the Ancere. Creatures as fierce and lethal as our shadowhounds. Charlie glanced down at the hound lying by Mish's feet. At the moment, with its head on its paws and its eyes closed, it looked neither fierce nor lethal. But Charlie knew appearances could often be deceiving. There has to be a way. I didn't come so far to give up now. We just have to. The wall on the other side of the room opened onto a corridor of pale non-light and a small, winged woman with flowing green hair hurtled out of it. She flew straight at Charlie. I find you, Charlie, I find you. She squealed happily as she came to a stop inches from his face, her iridescent wings glowing faintly blue. Charlie laughed. Spree, I can't tell you how happy I am to see you. She eyed the bandage wrapped around his head. I happy see you, too. Was not easy find you here. This place have much weird energy. But I do. She landed on top of the scrolls. I'm glad. What about the others? Have you seen any of them? Peter and Pierce with me, she said. No, have seen others. Mish stared down at her with a look of astonished wonder. From where did this fairy come? Spree whirled toward him, her wings turning red. I not a fairy. I a sprite. The hound raised its head at the sound of her voice and upon seeing her, growled, its lip lifted slightly. Spree hissed, showing her own sharp teeth. My pardons if I offended, Mish said as he laid a restraining hand on top of the hound's head. I meant no disrespect. You merely caught me by surprise. Well. That better, Spree said, the color in her wings fading. She eyed the hound distrustfully for a moment, then turned back to Charlie. You want I bring Pierce and Peter here? Peter first. Spree could only carry one person through her corridor at a time, and Charlie didn't want the little boy left anywhere alone, even for a few minutes. Will do. Spree flew back into her corridor. Mish stared after her. You have interesting friends. Charlie smiled thinly. You have no idea. 5 minutes later, Peter came out of the corridor. Charlie stood and Peter ran to him. He threw his arms around Charlie's waist. Smiling, Charlie gave him a hug. Are you okay? Peter looked up at Charlie and nodded. Where are we? The City of Magic. Wow, Peter said, his brown eyes wide. Charlie ruffled the boy's shaggy blonde hair. I couldn't have put it better myself. While Spree went to get Pierce, Charlie introduced Peter to Mish. The boy looked at the floor, as he always did when meeting new people. He was ashamed of the scar that ran from his left eye down across the length of his cheek, over the crease of his lip and halfway down his chin. It was faded and white with a bluish tint near the lips, but still clearly visible. A little memento to remember his father by. When Spree and Pierce returned, introductions were made again while the sprite settled down in Charlie's chair and promptly fell asleep. Carrying people through her corridor drained her magic, and, eager as Charlie was to see the others, he knew she would have to rest before she could go looking for them. Pierce listened as Charlie explained about the scrolls and the Solari. That is a problem. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on the tail of his shirt, a thoughtful expression on his face. These elves will be looking for the person who has the disc? Yes, Mish said. They want to find the magic as we do. Though for much different reasons. Then why not give them what they want? Pierce put his glasses back on. Let them take us right to the catacombs. They will kill him, Mish said. Are you certain? Pierce asked. Might they not want him to go at least as far as finding the magic first? Then they could try to destroy it, if it's such a threat to them. Mish frowned. I do not know. Perhaps. But it would be a terrible risk. If something were to happen to Charlie, all would be lost. But it would be the easiest way. Charlie was surprised he hadn't thought of the idea himself. And I have my magic to protect me. No, Pierce said. Mish is right. We can't endanger you or the disc. We'll have to send someone pretending to have the disc to the Solari and hope they don't kill him out of hand. I don't much like the idea of putting somebody's life at risk like that. Especially one of my friends, Charlie said. Who did you have in mind? Grant is equally as important as you are. If we get through this thing alive and victorious, he's the only one who can start both countries healing. We couldn't trust Thomas with it, and Peter is too young. Raven is tough, she can handle herself, but she's too liable to lose her temper and blow the whole thing. Miranda could do it, no doubt, but I can't see you letting her risk her life. That only leaves me. But you might get killed. Pierce smiled. It's my life, Charlie. I'm willing to take the risk. Besides, it's a small way to begin making up for the part one played in the deaths of your parents. If Pierce thought reminding Charlie of that would make him feel better about having the man risk his life, it didn't work. I'm the one most capable of handling things if there's trouble. I should go. You mean like you handled Duncan? Pierce asked. Your magic is formidable, I know, but it doesn't make you invincible. If not for Thomas's intervention, Duncan would have killed you. Charlie flushed in both annoyance and embarrassment. But he couldn't argue with the truth. Duncan had used his telekinesis to hold Charlie at bay, and his magic was useless in a fight if he couldn't get physical with his target. He would never forget how it had felt to have an invisible force pinning him to the floor, holding him helpless as Duncan stood over him with a gun in his hand. Think of it this way, Pierce said. If something happens to you, who will stop King Richard from dropping his bombs on Ferngale? Who will stop him from starting a war that would consume our entire world? You and this lost magic are all that can stand in the way of his madness. I see my own life as a little thing when compared to the fate of the world. I've done many terrible things in the service of the king, and I would like the chance to do something good. For myself, as much as for you. Charlie's shoulders sagged. It was a lot of pressure, to have the fate of the world on your shoulders. Okay. But I don't want to do anything until we're all together again. Mish's people will be keeping an eye out for the others, and if they can't find them, Spree will. It might take a day or two, but I'd feel better if I knew everyone was safe. All right. A day or two shouldn't make much difference. There was a knock at the door and Mish went to answer it. On the other side was an elven woman whose silver hair was in a braid like Mish's. "Come in," he said. "This is my sister, Ezel." She eyed the rest of them, her gaze lingering on the sleeping form of Spree. Then she and Mish began to talk back and forth in their own language. Finally, Mish turned to the others. "My sister says she and some others have found two strangers in the ruins. Thomas and Raven. These are some of your friends?" "Yes." Charlie felt a rush of relief only slightly tinted with disappointment that it was not Miranda and Grant. "Where are they?" Mish spoke to his sister and she turned to beckon to someone in the hall. Raven stepped through the doorway behind her. "Hi, Charlie." "Hi." He was glad to see her alive and well, but there was also a certain unspoken discomfort between the two of them. Something had happened between them during Charlie's stay with the elven resistance movement in Kiloreen. Something that, at the time, had made him feel very confused about his relationship with Miranda. But their reunion at the castle, though brief, had made him realize what he felt toward Raven was nothing compared to how he felt about Miranda. Only he hadn't had the chance to explain all that to Raven. Where's Thomas?" he asked. "He's in pretty bad shape," Raven said, "so they took him someplace where he could rest. I guess they'll use their magic to make him better." "I should go see him," Charlie said. "Mish, can your sister take me?" "Of course." He spoke to his sister. She nodded and smiled. "You can go right now." Charlie knew he would have to talk to Raven and soon. He owed her that much. But he was just as glad to put it off for the moment. Even if it meant going to see Thomas. He followed Ezel down a series of dimly lit halls to a small, round room empty except for a sort of cross between a cot and a hammock, on which Thomas was lying. "You don't look so good," Charlie said. And indeed he didn't. The older boy was pale and there were dark circles under his eyes. Thomas grinned up at him with blood on his teeth. "Thanks for noticing. The elves will fix you up," Charlie said. "Good as new." "Are you sure you want that, Charlie boy?" Charlie winced. If anybody else had asked such a question he would have given them a firm and immediate yes. But things with Thomas were too complicated for that. Once he would have liked nothing better than to see Thomas suffer. But that was before he found out they were brothers. There was so much bad blood between them, he didn't know if they could ever be friends. How could you be friends with someone, much less brothers, after you both tried to kill each other? "We'll leave in a day or two," Charlie said. "You need to be better by then." "So the gang's all here, huh?" Thomas's gaze drifted to the door. "Doesn't look like anybody's in much of a hurry to check up on me." Charlie assumed he meant Grant. "Miranda and Grant are still missing. As soon as Spree's up to it, I'll send her to look for them." "Oh." Thomas stared up at the ceiling. Charlie hesitated. Since Thomas's life was in danger as much any of theirs, and he'd certainly been through enough already, he deserved to know what it was all about. "You know about the bombs and the king's plan to use them?" "Yeah. That's why we're here. You see, I'm looking for something that was lost a long time ago. Something to give us an advantage over the king's army. Magic. A very ancient kind of magic that can, well, I guess it can make other elves like me. Give them warrior magic. I don't know if it's permanent when you aren't born with it, but I don't guess it matters." "What's your point?" Thomas asked, still not looking at him. "My point is even though we've never gotten along, and probably never will, we can agree on one thing. We don't either one of us want what King Richard wants." "You know how I know that?" "Do tell." "Because you saved my life. I couldn't figure out why at first. I know you hate me and you know I hate you. But after giving it some thought, I think I have it figured out. You saved my life because you knew I was your best chance of getting out of the castle alive. And that's what you care about most, yourself. That's why I think in the end you'll be on our side. You'll have to be, because you know the king will never take you over Grant. You can't go back to him, and you won't go out on your own. So you only have one option. Charlie turned toward the door. I'll let you think on that a little while. He stepped out into the hall. Ezel took him to another room much like Thomas's, except it was a bit larger and had 2 chairs and a little table besides the bed. Spree was asleep in one of the chairs. A tray of food waited on the table, but it was clear the sprite had already picked over it. Charlie ate, and once he was full and rested, he started to think about Raven again. Things were going to get crazy in the days ahead, and any of them could die, though he didn't like to think on it. He had to talk to her. If only to apologize. Spree? The sprite opened one brown eye and looked up at him. Time I go? No, you need to rest a while longer. I just wondered if you knew which room Raven is in, but... 3rd door right. She closed her eye again. Charlie went down the hall to the 3rd door on the right and just stood there a moment, staring at it. What was he going to say to her? He had never meant to lead her on, and he really did care for her. She was his friend, and maybe, if not for Miranda, she might have been more. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. She opened it right away and seemed surprised to see him. Oh, hi, Charlie. You want to come in? Yeah. We need to talk. He walked past her into a room identical to his own. I guess we do. She shut the door and turned to face him. It's about you and Miranda, right? After the way you kissed her back at the castle, I kind of figured you were more than friends. He didn't know any way to do this but to just come right out and say it. I love her. I see. She leaned back against the door. Funny you never so much as mentioned her name all the time you were in Kiloreen. I know. I'm sorry. He shook his head. At first, I didn't talk about her because it hurt too much. I missed her and I was worried about her, and there didn't seem to be any reason for it. Then, when there was a reason, I had already started to like you. And I thought if I could like you that way, maybe I didn't really love Miranda the way I thought I did. I was confused. I know it's not a good excuse, but it's the truth. He stared down at the floor. It's okay, Charlie. I understand. Besides, you're not the only one who wasn't completely honest in Kiloreen. Me and Jack, well, I don't know. Nothing ever happened between us, but we kind of had something going. Which was probably part of the reason why he didn't like you. Charlie raised his head. So you're not mad? Mad? No. Disappointed? Yeah, maybe a little. I do like you. I like you a lot. But love, I don't think so. I saw the look in your eyes when we found the camp destroyed, and I knew something personal was hurting you. I knew somebody in that camp was closer to you than I could ever be. When we found Miranda alive at the castle, I knew it was her. Maybe, if things were different, we might have got to love. But it's not going to happen. I care about you, though. I want to be friends. Charlie let out a slow breath. I want to be friends, too. I never meant to hurt you. I know. But I'll get over it. Maybe Miranda and I could even be friends. If you love her so much, she must be a good person. She is. He cleared his throat. Did Pierce tell you what the plan was? Yeah. Do you really think it'll work? I don't know. I hope so. I'd hate for anything bad to happen to Pierce. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Sorry, it's just, after everything Pierce told you. After all he did to your parents. You don't hold a grudge. She shook her head. Most people would. I would. But I guess I shouldn't be surprised, since you don't have one against Thomas either. I don't know how you can be so forgiving. With everything that's going on, I don't have the luxury of holding a grudge. Besides, Pierce is Grant's friend. He trusts the man, and that's good enough for me. And Thomas? It's complicated. Yeah, I guess family can be that way. You're stuck with them, whether you like it or not. That's why friends are better. You get to pick them. You ask me, it ought to be other way around. Charlie laughed. It would be nice, wouldn't it? On the other hand, if they had both had their choices, they'd have had different parents, and he supposed they wouldn't be the people they were. I guess I'm going to try and get some sleep. I have the feeling there won't be much time for rest in the days ahead. I'll see you tomorrow, Charlie. When Charlie left Raven's room, he felt much better than when he'd entered it. He was glad they'd talked and got everything out in the open. He didn't want to think they wouldn't have another chance, but he was all too aware of the possibility. 5. Grant and Miranda stood in a room of white marble. In the center of the room stood a blue pedestal, and atop the pedestal was a golden magestone about the same size as a basketball. It was not the largest of such stones Miranda had ever seen, but it was certainly the most uniform in shape. A perfect globe. Beside the pedestal stood an elven woman in white robes. Her long silver hair fell down past her waist. The man who had led Grant and Miranda to this place spoke excitedly to the woman in their native tongue as he showed her the drawing of the disc. Her reply was brief and given with a smile. The man bowed and left the room. The elf woman laid her hand on the magestone and it began to glow. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was soft and soothing. "I am called Everclear. May I have your names, strangers?" They gave their names, and Miranda was relieved to find there was some way for them to communicate. Though she had never heard of a magestone being used as a translator before. "We are well met," Everclear said. "I do not mean to rush, but your arrival is some cause for excitement. You are like no people I have ever seen, and my priest tells me you recognize the disc in the drawing. Yet he thinks you do not possess it. Is this true?" Miranda wasn't sure how much to tell, but she supposed if these elves were to help them, she must tell the truth. "A friend has it. But we don't know where he is. We used a magestone to bring us here, only we somehow got separated." Everclear nodded. "The void that surrounds us interfered with the magic, I am sure. If the one who bears the disc is here, we must strive to find him quickly. So long as he is wandering about our city, he will be in grave danger." "Danger?" Miranda's heart jumped. "What kind of danger?" "There are other elves here. They call themselves the Undine, and they have long been our enemies. They worship the dark force slowly consuming the city, and if they find your friend before we do, they will surely kill him." "Then we have to find him first," Grant said. "We have to find him. Now." "Wait." Miranda laid her hand on his arm. "You're forgetting someone." She smiled at the confused look on his face. "Spree. If she isn't with Charlie already, she soon will be. Then he'll send her to find us." "This is another friend?" Everclear asked. "Perhaps one with magic?" "Yes," Miranda said. "She has a way of carrying people across distances that will be much quicker and safer than traveling on foot. If we just wait, Charlie will come to us." "Then all hope is not lost," Everclear said. "We of the Solari have long awaited the one who will open the silver catacombs and bring back the lost magic." "Do you know where the catacombs are?" Grant asked. "Yes. But they will not be easy to reach, for the entrance lies beyond the void. Once this friend, Charlie, once he is with us, I will take you there. Until then, perhaps we should find you a room where you can rest and have something to eat." "That would be much appreciated," Grant said. "Thank you." "Yes, thank you," Miranda said. Another female elf, this one dressed in gray, took them to a room all of white stone, like everything else in the place. There was only one bed, but Miranda hoped they wouldn't need it. If only Charlie could come to them soon, today, perhaps within the hour, they could get on about this business of finding the lost magic and go home. To war. She would have liked nothing better than to postpone that indefinitely, but it was not possible. The only way to stop a world war was for Kiloreen to defeat Angland. Perhaps the war had already started. There was no way to know. Before they had escaped the castle, the resistance had attacked the mining camps where many elves were forced to mine for magestones, the single most profitable resource the world had to offer, and it was only to be found in Kiloreen. So, in a way, she supposed the war had already started. She only wondered if Angland had retaliated yet. Aside from the bed, there were 2 chairs and a small table. Miranda sank down in one of these chairs. Until that moment, she had not realized how exhausted she was. Between the effects of the drugs, Commander Angard's unpleasant questioning techniques, and trying to keep a mental eye on Charlie, she'd not had much rest since she turned herself over to the soldiers. "Why don't you lie down and try to rest?" Grant said. "You look worn through." "I am. But what about you?" "I was locked up in a cell the last few days, it's true, but I didn't have to deal with Commander Angard. I know what he's like. And you've had all those drugs in your system. You need the rest more than I do." "Okay. But if Spree shows up, you'll wake me, won't you?" "Of course." Miranda lay down on top of the sheets. They were cool and soft against her arms. She sighed as she felt her body start to relax. "Charlie, wherever you are, I hope you're safe." That was the last thought she had before sleep wrapped her up in its warm embrace. 6. Thomas opened his eyes on a dimly lit room and for one panicked moment thought he was back in the castle. He sat up, expecting to find his wrist chained to the bed. Only it wasn't, and once his racing heart started to calm, he remembered where he was. With memory came a flash of annoyance, even anger, at Charlie's superior, know-it-all attitude. The worst thing was, he was right. Thomas was all out of choices, and that was not a situation that sat well with him. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and found his dirty, blood-stained clothes had been traded for a black and gold uniform like the elves wore. Then he realized he felt no pain, no dizziness. He felt good. Really good. Better than he had in a very long time. A pair of black boots sat beside the low, narrow bed and Thomas pulled them on before he stood up. He stretched his arms over his head and took a deep, satisfying breath that didn't end with him doubled over in a coughing fit for a change. The room was bare save for the bed and a tray on the floor which held a plate of food and a pitcher of water. Thomas's stomach growled at the smell, though he could not readily identify what the food might be. But first, the door. Just to be sure. The knob turned easily in his hand and the door opened on a long, dimly lit hall. Leaving the door open, Thomas picked up the tray and sat on the bed. Eating the food didn't help to tell him what it was, but it tasted good and he was hungry, so he ate it all anyway. "You must be feeling better." Thomas looked up to see Ezel standing in the doorway. The maidstone necklace cast a bloody glow across her pale skin. "I guess I have you to thank for that." It irked him to think he might owe something to an elf. "Healing is but one of my many talents. Like mind reading." She smiled. "Yes. Though not everyone knows about that. There are things, forbidden things, that can be done to enhance one's magic, and I wouldn't want certain people to find out about it. I hope Raven doesn't have a loose tongue." "You're worried about her, but not me?" "Why?" "She's one of your own kind." "I'm not." "She may have elven blood in her veins, but the truth is you and I have much more in common." "Really?" Thomas sat back and folded his arms. "Such as?" Ezel stepped into the room and drew the door shut. "Troublesome brothers. Mish leads the Undine when it should, by rights, Beanie. But our father never trusted me. Before he died, he named Mish his successor instead of me. Your brother betrayed his father, his country, and yet he still stands to be the next king while you, the loyal son, have been mistreated and ignored. We both know what it is to suffer injustice. What's your point? Thomas asked, though he thought he knew. She wanted something from him and he was just interested enough to hear her out. Maybe he wasn't completely out of options after all. We can help each other to achieve our goals. She came over to the bed, knelt in front of him, and laid her hands lightly on his legs. It took a strong effort not to recoil from her touch. If she believed she could seduce him, she wasn't nearly as good a mind reader as she thought she was. How are we going to do that? Soon, Mish will send the man called Pierce to the Solari pretending to be Charlie. They will show him the way to the catacombs, where the magic waits. Mish and the others will follow them. All you have to do is go along and send me mental pictures of where you are so my men and I can find you. Once the magic is freed, we'll take and use it for our own purposes. You mean you will use it, Thomas said. I'm not stupid. I know I can't do anything with elf magic. How do I know once you have it you won't turn on me? An intense look came into her silver eyes. This city is dying and so are we. I want to leave this place and take my people back to the old world. Once there, it would be to my benefit to be aligned with a king. If you want the throne, I can give it to you. And what if I want something else as well? He leaned toward her and ran his fingers along her cheek. She aroused no interest in him whatsoever. He simply wanted to see how far she was willing to go and how likely it was she would carry through on promises made. He didn't care much for the idea of aligning himself with elves, but if it could give him what he wanted, he would do it. Ezel caught his wrist, gazing into his eyes. Too many of my people fear what they call the dark magic. They don't understand what it can do. How it can give you anything you desire. A shimmering glow surrounded her whole body, and when it faded, Thomas found himself staring into Miranda's green eyes. It's not real, Thomas said. You aren't her. It's just an illusion. Are you certain? I look like her. I sound like her. She brushed her lips across his fingertips. I feel like her. A shiver ran across his skin despite the burning heat pulsing through his body. She leaned in closer, until their lips were only inches apart. Life is full of illusion. Her breath was warm against his skin. Our perceptions deceive us at every turn. Thomas reached out and ran a shaking hand through her silky, red hair. As he had done in his dreams 100 times. The smell of strawberry shampoo wafted up and a painful cramp hit him low in the abdomen. You see? I can give you anything, Ezel said. I will give you anything. And all you have to do is let Charlie lead you to the magic, then kill him before he can use it. Thomas smiled. I like the way you think. Then he pulled her to him. 7. Miranda stood on a slight rise beneath tall trees and stared down into a little valley. She had no idea where she was, though there was something vaguely familiar about the place. Not as if she had been there before, but more as if someone had spoken to her of it. A waterfall cascaded down a rock wall into a little brook that split the valley in half. On the left was a sun-dappled forest, on the right, a cave. Then it hit her. This was Charlie's place. The one he so often dreamed about. But how had she gotten here? Down below, Charlie stepped out from the forest and approached the brook. Miranda called out to him, but he continued on as if he had not heard. She started to move forward, to go to him, but found herself rooted to the spot. It's a dream, she thought. But is it mine, or his? Charlie crossed the brook and moved toward the cave. He paused at the entrance, and that was when Miranda sensed someone beside her, though she could not see anyone. A voice, strangely hollow and distorted, called out Charlie's name. He turned and looked up, directly at Miranda. A dull whomp echoed off the rocks. Charlie jerked back, a startled expression on his face. A bright red blossom of blood spread out across his chest and he was falling. No! Miranda sat up on the bed and clutched her chest. What's wrong? Grant rose from his seat and came over to her. Miranda? Are you okay? I had a bad dream. A bad dream, yes, but more. A vision. A warning. She'd never dreamed of the future before. Not that she could recall. Nor had such a clear vision without the aid of the drugs. But a vision it was, she was sure. Telling her Charlie was going to die unless she could do something to prevent it. After everything you've been through, it's no wonder you're having bad dreams. Grant laid a hand on her shoulder. But you're awake now and everything is okay. Somehow she managed to smile back at him. Part of her wanted to tell him about the vision, but another part knew she couldn't. His desire to protect Charlie would overcome all else, and there was still so much they had to do. Much as she loved Charlie, Miranda knew he'd been born for a purpose and she was supposed to help him fulfill it. She had already done things that weighed heavy on her conscience to get him this far. She had to see him reach that valley even if it meant risking his life. The wall beside the bed began to shimmer and Miranda was up on her feet even before Spree was out. She looked anxiously past the sprite, but she was alone. Where's Charlie? With other friends. You last two I need find. Who go first? You go, Grant said to Miranda. Explain everything to Charlie. I'll wait here in case Everclear needs to talk to one of us. Okay. She followed Spree into the corridor. Charlie had explained the experience to her once, but she hadn't really understood until now. There was a feeling around her of vast emptiness filled with light that was somehow not really light at all, though she could clearly see Spree walking ahead of her. With each footstep the sprite left behind a blue glow that matched the light in her wings. Miranda had the feeling she was no longer in the city of magic, or anywhere she could really understand. And if she were to somehow be separated from Spree, she felt certain this was a place in which she could get hopelessly lost. They came out of the corridor into a room of dark stone. Charlie was pacing in front of a low bed that looked like a cross between a cot and a hammock, but stopped when he saw them. Charlie and Miranda just stared at each other, frozen in the moment. Then she was across the room and in his arms, and it felt so good to be so close. To know he was safe. You have no idea how happy I am to see you, he said. She pulled back a little and looked into his brown eyes. Don't you think I'm happy to see you, too? Charlie smiled in the shy kind of way he had. I hope you are. I am. Just in case he needed proof, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. His arms tightened around her. Spree fluttered up near their faces and cleared her throat. I get Grant now? No, not yet. Yes, go ahead, they said simultaneously. Charlie frowned. Why shouldn't she get Grant? We need to talk first. She took his hand and led him over to the chairs. They sat, and Miranda explained everything that had happened since the castle, leaving out nothing except her vision. Then Charlie took his turn to tell her what had been going on with him, and when he was finished they sat a while in silence, both lost to their own thoughts. Do you trust these Undine? Miranda asked. Do you think Mish is telling you the truth and Everclear is lying? I don't know, Charlie said. But one thing they both seem to agree on is the Solari know the location of the catacombs. That makes me think the idea to send Pierce to them pretending to be me, while risky, might really be the best option. You're right, Miranda said. But you do realize this means I'll have to go back? If I just disappear, Everclear is bound to get suspicious. Yeah. He sighed. It seems like every time we get together, something pulls us apart. I know. She didn't want to go. She wanted to stop time right here, right now, and stay with him. But it can't last forever, right? Right. He nodded. Someday this will all be over and we can be together always. Sounds nice. And it did. Unfortunately, she had the feeling things weren't going to end up that way. I should go. They both stood, but Miranda made no move toward the corridor. Charlie, her eyes filled up with tears. She threw her arms around his neck and pressed her head against his shoulder. Charlie ran a soothing hand through her hair. Hey, you told me once I was meant for great things, right? Yes, she said, her voice muffled by his t-shirt. Then nothing bad is going to happen to me. I'll find the catacombs and everything will be all right. She pulled away and looked him directly in the eyes. Don't you go into that valley without me, you hear? What's wrong? He searched her face. What aren't you telling me? Did you see something? No. I have this feeling we're supposed to be together, that's all. She hated to lie to him now, with the future so uncertain before them. But if she told him the truth, he would never let her go with him to the valley. Promise me you won't go without me. All right. I promise. He touched her cheek. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. I know. She gave him a quick kiss. I better go. Right. Charlie turned to Spree. Take Miranda through first, then Pierce. And don't come back. I want you to stay with Miranda. I no like to leave you, Spree said. But I need you to take care of Miranda for me. Can you do that? She didn't look too happy about it, but she nodded. Can do. Thanks, Spree. He turned back to Miranda. Tell Grant I'll see him soon. I will. It was no easy thing, to leave him, to step back into the corridor with this heavy weight hanging over her. She knew the feeling. It was the same one she'd had in the days leading up to the attack on the camp. It was a feeling of death. 8. The red sun rose over the horizon, streaking the morning sky with bands of amber light. Charlie's group, which consisted of himself, Raven, Thomas, Peter, Mish, a dozen and Dean, and a half-dozen shadowhounds, were crouched among the ruins on a slight rise overlooking the Solari compound. In the courtyard of the compound, an elf was harnessing 2 shaggy ponies, with 10-inch horns in the center of their foreheads, to a wagon. Another elf patrolled the area with a creature that from this distance looked like some kind of large, maned cat. That is an Anser, Mish said. We must stay upwind of the creature or it will catch our scent. The door to one of the buildings opened and out came Pierce, Miranda, and Grant, accompanied by several elves and more of the Anser. Spree was there as well, riding on Miranda's shoulder. There is Everclear. Mish pointed toward an elf woman in flowing white robes. In her right hand she carried a long staff topped by a perfectly round magestone. We must be especially wary of her. She is very dangerous. Should we stay upwind of her, too? Thomas asked with a grin. Mish gave him a flat look. This is no time for foolishness. Sorry. Thomas held his hands up defensively. Just trying to lighten things up a bit. This is serious, Charlie said. Thomas was acting entirely too cheerful about this whole thing. It made him even more nervous than he already was. One mistake could get us all killed. All right, already. I said I was sorry. I won't speak another word. He made a zipping motion across his mouth, but he was still grinning. Charlie hated the thought, but he preferred Thomas miserable and half dead. At least he wouldn't have to worry the older boy might stab him in the back. He turned his attention back to the courtyard. The wagon pulled out into the dirt street, surrounded by 24 Solari and half as many Anser. The fact they were outnumbered didn't bother Charlie any. He had dealt with worse odds on his own. They moved along the rise until they could descend down behind the partially intact buildings lining the road. Charlie kept Peter at his side, wanting the boy near him if there was trouble. And he was certain there would be trouble. It seemed to wait around every corner for him these days. He saw no reason for it to be different here. As they followed silently behind the Solari, Charlie's chest began to feel tight. The dragon inside him stirred uneasily, sensing the nearing presence of some malevolent entity that was all too aware of his existence. "I do not understand what they are about," Mish said. "Nothing lies in this direction save for the edge of the city where waits the void." "Could the catacombs be inside the void?" Charlie asked. Somehow, the idea unsettled him. "There is nothing inside the void," Mish said. "It is empty and barren." "Yeah, Charlie," Thomas said. "Don't you know the meaning of the word? Why don't you shut up?" Raven glared at him. Thomas grinned back at her. "Why don't you make me?" "Maybe I will." Her hands tightened around her rifle. "Both of you shut up," Charlie said. The tension building inside his mind was starting to get to him, and their stupid bickering didn't help. He turned back to Mish. "You told me there were creatures in the void. The ones the Solari worshipped. But they are not creatures such as you and I," Mish said. "They need neither food nor drink to sustain their lives, if you can call such an existence life, and thus they need no land on which to live." "You could be wrong," Charlie said. "You can't know for sure if you've never been there." He felt an odd certainty there was land of a sort within the void. The elves had named it such, but it was not the true name of the place, and a place it was, not some empty darkness. Another world, as was the place they passed through when traversing Spree's corridor. Charlie was vaguely aware this knowledge came from the dragon. Mish's expression grew troubled. "You are right. I cannot know for certain. But I can only hope our path does not lead within the void. My very soul trembles at the thought of entering that foul place." Charlie wasn't too keen on the idea himself. The partially intact buildings came to end at an open space beyond which was a wall of darkness that writhed like a living thing. Charlie's group climbed up the backside of a pile of debris to watch as the wagon drew up near the wall, then came to a stop. Miranda and the others climbed out. Everclear and Pierce approached the wall and faced it for several minutes. Then Pierce looked over his shoulder at Grant with a nervous expression. Something's wrong, Charlie thought. He used his magic to heighten his sense of hearing so he could listen in. "The disc is the only way to open the path through the void," Everclear said. Her voice was soft and pleasant. "You do have the disc, do you not? You must, if you are the one we have been waiting for." Oh. Charlie had the disc in his pocket, as they had felt it too dangerous to risk letting Pierce take it. But he was unsure whether or not this was the right time to come out of hiding and let their presence be known. "Unless you do not have the disc." Everclear's voice hardened. "You are not the one. This is a trick." The stone atop her staff dimmed and she spoke in her native tongue. The other Solari moved in on Miranda and Grant. One of them grabbed Miranda roughly by the arm. Spree let out an ear-splitting shriek as she leapt off Miranda's shoulder and into the face of the elf, her wings gone black. The elf stumbled back and started to scream as his skin bubbled where the sprite rented with teeth and claws. Everclear lowered her staff and a beam of light burst from the magestone to strike Spree in the chest. She fell limply to the ground as the elf she had attacked continued to howl in agony. "No!" Without giving it a thought, Charlie scrambled over the pile of debris, ignoring the sound of Raven calling his name, and slid down the other side into the clearing. All eyes focused on him. Everclear turned her staff toward him, but Miranda leapt at the elf woman and knocked her off balance so the beam struck the rubble to Charlie's left. Rocks rained down upon his head. One of the elves cried out and an Anser ran toward Charlie. He braced himself as the heat of his magic filled his veins. A shadowhound sailed over Charlie's head and collided with the Anser mid-leap. Both creatures went rolling. They came up on their paws, snapping and snarling and tearing at each other. The other Anser raced forward, followed close by the Solari, as the Undine and the shadowhounds came over the top of the pile. and Charlie, caught right in the middle, had no choice but to join in the fight. 9. Miranda climbed out of the back of the wagon, eyeing the wall of blackness nervously. It writhed as if alive, and the sight made her skin crawl. Everclear called Pierce over to join her before the wall, and that was when everything started to go wrong. "What is this?" Pierce asked. "I thought you were taking us to the catacombs." "We must first pass through the void," Everclear said. "The catacombs lie beyond. You must use the disc now to open the path. My staff will lend the power the disc needs." "Oh, the disc. Right." Pierce looked over his shoulder at Grant. "Oh no," Miranda thought. They had not expected this. They had thought they would come to the entrance of the catacombs before they would have to use the disc, and, by then, they would no longer need the Solari. "The disc is the only way to open the path through the void," Everclear said. Her voice was soft and pleasant, but a tightness around her eyes suggested she was losing her patience. "You do have the disc, do you not? You must, if you are the one we have been waiting for." Not yet, Miranda thought, hoping Charlie would not do anything in haste. If his group came out now, there would be a fight, and they still didn't know the exact location of the catacombs. "Unless you do not have the disc." Everclear's voice hardened. "You are not the one." Her eyes darted around. "This is a trick." The stone atop her staff dimmed, and she spoke in her native tongue. The other Solari moved in toward Miranda and Grant. One of them grabbed Miranda roughly by the arm, and she felt a flutter of panic. A sudden shriek rang in Miranda's ears as Spree launched off her shoulder and into the face of the elf. The elf stumbled back and started to scream as his skin bubbled where the sprite rented with teeth and claws. Miranda felt frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Beside her, Grant only stared helplessly as Everclear lowered her staff. A beam of light burst forth from the mage stone and struck Spree in the chest. The sprite fell limply to the ground as the elf she had attacked continued to howl in agony. A horrified shout made Miranda turn in time to see Charlie slide down the side of a nearby pile of debris. Everclear lowered her staff toward Charlie, and Miranda realized the elf woman had no way of knowing who he was. For Spree's sake, she could hope the blast was only meant to stun, but with the mage stone trained on Charlie, she couldn't take the chance. Miranda leapt at Everclear and knocked her off balance, so the blast struck the debris off to Charlie's left. Miranda made a grab for the staff, desperate to take it away from Everclear before the elf woman could use it again. The sound of fighting erupted nearby as Everclear wrenched the staff free of Miranda's grasp, then struck her on the side of the head with the mage stone. Miranda stumbled back, stunned. A trickle of blood slid down the side of her face. Everclear turned toward the fighting. Charlie was in the midst of it, moving with the spooky speed and precision his magic afforded him. Miranda could not allow the woman to get a beat on him. She searched about frantically for some kind of weapon and spotted a hefty chunk of stone lying on the ground. She lifted it, ignoring the sudden wave of dizziness the action caused, and threw it with all her might at Everclear. The stone hit Everclear in the shoulder instead of the back of the head, as had been Miranda's intent. The elf woman whirled around, her lip lifted in a feral snarl, and she lowered the staff at Miranda. 10. Thomas was lying next to Charlie, broadcasting everything back to Ezel, when things went wrong. He was not the least bit surprised when Charlie jumped over the top of the rubble and slid down the other side like a fool. Raven made a grab for Charlie, calling his name, and cursed as her hand closed around nothing but empty air. Thomas watched with a touch of unease as the Onsair ran toward Charlie. If the idiot got killed now, it would ruin everything. One of the Shadowhounds leapt up as if somebody had kicked it and sailed over Charlie's head to collide with the beast. Then Mish was barking orders, and he and the others ran up over the top of the pile, no doubt intent on joining the fight. Thomas, on the other hand, was glad enough to stay right where he was. Raven clapped her hand down on Peter's shoulder and looked the little boy sternly in the eyes. "No matter what happens, you stay here until one of us come to get you, you hear? And hold on to this." She pushed her rifle into his hands. Peter nodded, staring at the gun with wide eyes. Raven glanced with contempt at Thomas, then followed after the Undine and the Shadowhounds. Thomas imagined her getting her guts spilled and smiled. He watched the fight from safety and wondered who would win. It better be Charlie, because they still needed him to open the catacombs. But with the way he fought, there was little doubt he would come out on top. Then he saw Miranda and Everclear struggling for the staff and felt an unexpected flutter of panic in his chest. The flutter got a little stronger when the elf woman struck Miranda on the head with the magestone. Thomas looked at the rifle clutched in the hands of the little boy. Before they left the Undine compound, Ezel had given him something that was supposed to help when the time came to kill Charlie. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. It was a small, circular tube about an inch long with a super-thin piece of amber-tinted magestone at one end. It worked something like a spyglass, allowing the person who wore it to see further away than they normally could. He fingered the object uncertainly for a moment, then slipped it into his eye as Ezel had shown him. "Give me the gun," he said, reaching for it. Peter pulled back. "Raven said for me to hold it. And I said give it to me." He grabbed the barrel of the rifle and jerked it out of Peter's hands. Then he turned back to the fight. Everclear was turning around, lowering the staff toward Miranda. Thomas lay flat out on his stomach and fitted the rifle up against his shoulder, remembering only at the last moment to switch it from volley fire to single shot. He pressed the eye with the little spyglass in it to the gun sight, aimed for Everclear's head, and pulled the trigger. The elf woman went down with a spray of blood, and Miranda turned. Her shocked gaze fixed on Thomas for a moment, then Grant stepped between them with his back to Thomas. Pretty soon after that the fighting was over, and in the litter of bodies scattered across the ground, only one was Undine. Charlie, pale and shaken, knelt beside Spree's limp form. He lifted her up, then sat there cradling her in his arms. Raven came and put her arm around his shoulders. Thomas pocketed the spyglass, then climbed down from the pile of debris, with Peter close behind. They walked over to Miranda and Grant. "You saved my life," Miranda said in a shocked tone. She was looking at him in a way she never had before. Thomas shrugged, though the look made his heart beat faster. "Let's not make a big thing out of it. I'll take that now." Grant held his hand out for the rifle. Thomas felt a flash of irritation, but didn't show it. He gave his brother a crooked smile and handed the rifle over. "Sure thing, big brother. Whatever you want." "Poor Charlie," Miranda said, looking toward him. "He's been through so much and now this." Thomas gritted his teeth. "Poor Charlie? Really?" There she stood with blood running down the side of her head, and all she could think about was poor Charlie? He hadn't even come over to see if she was all right, and now he was sitting there with another girl's arm around him, and it was still poor Charlie. It was always poor Charlie the whole world revolved around. And people said he was self-centered. 11. Warrior magic made Charlie faster and stronger than most, evening out the odds in favor of the Undine. When the fighting was over and the dead lay scattered around him, he felt sick and shaken, as he always did after a fight. He didn't like to kill. But somewhere along the way he'd learned that at times there was simply no other choice. But for all the power he had, he could do nothing for Spree. He knelt in the dirt beside her and pulled her small, limp body into his lap. The center of her chest was marred by a black mark surrounded by charred flesh. Her long, green hair trailed across his fingers. They had been through a lot together since the night she helped him sneak into the school's record room. The night he had first learned his good friend Grant was the Crown Prince. That night seemed almost like a dream. Like it had been some other boy down there in the basement. And he supposed, in a way, it had been. For surely he was now as far removed from that person as he could get. Spree had stayed behind with Grant when Charlie and the other kids were hauled off to the prison camp, but only because he told her to. And eventually she had come to look for him. She had found him beaten, dehydrated, and half-starved to death in the darkness of the pit, and carried him to Grant. From there to Kiloreen and back to Angland to here. Through good times and bad, she had been ever faithful and true. A friend anyone would be lucky to call their own. He never could have made it so far without her. Now, just like that, she was gone. Raven knelt beside him and laid her arm across his shoulders. She didn't say a word, for which he was grateful. Silent tears spilled down his cheeks, and if she had tried to give some words of comfort she would only have made things worse. He knew he hadn't the time to grieve Spree the way she deserved to be grieved. There was still so much to do and time was never on their side. He stood, cradling Spree gently in his arms, and went over to the pile of rubble. Nobody said a word or came near him as he laid her on the ground and slowly covered her with chunks of rock. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was all he could do under the circumstances. When he was through, the cairn stood as high as his knee. He stood beside it a moment, saying a silent goodbye, then turned back toward the others. "Are you all right?" he asked, stopping beside Miranda. The blood on her face worried him. "Yes." Her green eyes searched his face. "Are you?" "No." He kissed her cheek, then stepped around her to face the void. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the disc. It looked so small and innocuous lying there in the palm of his hand, but it had been the cause of so much grief. Part of him would have liked nothing better than to fling the cursed thing away, but he couldn't do it. He had to stand firm and do what needed doing. There were other things far more important than his bruised heart. The magestone in the disc was weak, maybe even dead. So, much as the idea of touching the weapon that had killed Spree repulsed him, he lifted Everclear's staff from where it had fallen, not sparing so much as a glance at the dead woman. He touched the stone in the disc to the one on top of the staff. The disc began to glow silver as the words etched upon it rose into the air. A bright, white light shot out from the combined stones to strike the void. A shrieking sound filled the air and the ground beneath Charlie's feet began to shake. Charlie felt a pressure against him as the void resisted the cutting beam. His magic rose up in response, burning in his veins. The light turned from white to red as it slowly formed itself into the shimmering image of a fiery red dragon, the embodiment of Charlie's magic. The glow burned hotter and brighter, until Charlie was forced to close his eyes against it. The radiance faded and Charlie opened his eyes to see a tunnel of light cut through the darkness. A tunnel not unlike Spree's corridor. He felt a momentary pang, but quickly pushed it away. No time for that now. He looked over his shoulder. Everybody on the wagon. "Grant, you drive. What are you going to do?" Miranda asked. Charlie faced the void again, a grim expression on his face. "I'll take the lead. If there's trouble, I want to be the first to meet it." 12. Miranda climbed up on the wagon seat beside Grant, staring at Charlie's back with apprehension. With Spree's death she was forcefully reminded of her dream vision, and the fact that Raven had brought along one of the automatic rifles made her wonder if the shot would come from someone in their own group. So far as she knew, the only weapons the elves here possessed were the blue energy rods carried by the Undine. She had no idea what had become of the other rifle. The one Pierce had. She turned in the seat as the wagon trundled into the tunnel, her eyes scanning the rubble for any signs of pursuit. But of course no one was back there. She was being paranoid. It was only that she preferred to think the shot would come from some enemy they didn't yet know about. Easier than thinking one of them would be responsible. In the back of the wagon, Raven was pale but composed, her rifle gripped firmly in both hands. Pierce had his arm around Peter, who'd not spoken a word to anyone. Thomas leaned back with his hands behind his head, a little smile on his lips. Mish was tense, his expression grim. As were the expressions of the other Undine, who trooped along on either side of the wagon, weapons at the ready. The Shadowhounds were close beside them. "Anything wrong?" Grant asked. No, she turned to face forward again. Thomas. He was the only one in their group who might shoot Charlie. But she didn't want to believe it. He'd saved Charlie's life and hers, surely that was proof enough he was on their side. But his little smile nagged at the corners of her mind. As they traveled through the tunnel, vague shadowy forms peered at them through the light. Miranda gripped Grant's arm. "Charlie." "I see them," Charlie said. They can't come through the light. We're safe." But his voice lacked the conviction to match the words. "I'm glad I have my gun," Raven said. "If it'll be of any use against those things." "If there's trouble, Charlie can handle it," Grant said. "You have to have faith in him." "I do have faith in him," Raven said. "But he's only one person, and if things get weird in here he might need help. I'm not sure how much we can give against those, whatever those things are, but..." "Wraiths." Mish cast an uneasy glance at the faces. "I do not know if any weapon can harm them, but perhaps the hounds can. If they will fight such creatures." "If?" Raven asked. "You don't think they will?" "I do not know." "They'll fight for Charlie," Miranda said. She could say this with certainty, and not only because of what had happened back at the castle. The Shadowhounds had some kind of affinity for the magic inside Charlie, and they would obey its wishes without Charlie having to say a word. She felt sure of it. It made those faces staring down at her a little easier to bear. 13. Thomas leaned back in the wagon with his hands behind his head and listened to the others talk. He didn't feel too good about those faces himself, and he hoped Miranda was right about the hounds because he wasn't sure those wraiths were something Charlie Boy could handle on his own. He also wasn't sure about Ezel and her Undine. Every now and then, he would cast a furtive glance back, careful to not let the others see. Each time there was nothing behind them but empty tunnel. He was still broadcasting, only he wasn't certain anybody was there to pick it up. As Thomas watched the faces, they suddenly disappeared, like a school of fish darting away at the approach of a predator. He did not look forward to finding out what would frighten such things. I hate to be the bearer of bad news," he said, sitting up, "but I think we're about to have some trouble." The Shadowhounds growled in almost perfect unison, their glowing red eyes fixed on the tunnel wall to the left. "Something is wrong," Mish said. "Stop the wagon." "Whoa!" Grant reined the ponies to a stop. The elves were tensed and a sense of waiting filled the air. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing happened. Grant stood up and looked around. "Whatever the hounds sense, it can't get through the light. We should..." His words were cut off by a shrill shriek. Something black and vaguely human-shaped swooped through the wall of the tunnel on the left. It slammed into Grant, lifting him off his feet and carrying him through the tunnel wall into the void. For a breath nobody moved, then Charlie dropped both the staff and the disc and plunged after them. 2 Shadowhounds were hot on his heels. "Charlie!" Miranda looked about ready to go after him, something Thomas felt would have been truly stupid, but more wraiths started to come through the walls. Out of the wagon, Pierce shouted. Thomas didn't have to be told twice. He vaulted over the side of the wagon, then crawled underneath it as shrieks filled the air, accompanied with blue flashes of light and snarls as the elves and hounds tried to fend off their attackers. The stuttering sound of an automatic rifle filled the air as Raven loosed the last of her ammo. Thomas was unable to see if the bullets had any effect on the wraiths, but one of the ponies screamed and the wagon suddenly lurched forward. Thomas had just enough time to roll his legs up out of the way before the slight protection of the wagon was gone. Wraiths darted here and there, swooping and diving at those in the tunnel. Not 3 feet from Thomas, a dead elf laid in a puddle of blood, his chest ripped open to the bone. A panicky terror began to well up inside Thomas as a little voice in the back of his head screamed at him to run. The only safe way was back the direction they had come, as he seemed to be at the edge of the battle and that way lay free and clear. Another Undine fell beneath a shrieking wraith, his face left unrecognizable by the creature's claws. That did it for Thomas. He rolled over onto all fours and crawled away until he felt it safe enough to stand. Then he ran. "Thomas," Miranda's voice called after him, "don't leave us." He didn't even slow, but ran full out as fast as he could down the tunnel. Toward safety. Toward life. What good would it do him to turn back anyway? Better a live coward than a dead hero, he thought. He was not Charlie, to throw himself between someone else and death. That was a fool's notion. Charlie was probably already dead. And if he was stuck here anyway, he might as well live to enjoy it. He was aligned with Ezel, who would be leader of the Undine once those wraiths killed Mish. And with Everclear gone, the Solari were open for grabs. Maybe he could make a decent sort of life for himself here. It wouldn't be like back home, but any kind of life was better than the alternative. So what if Miranda died? Even if Thomas was King of Angland, even if Charlie was dead, she would never be his. Ezel could be Miranda for him whenever he wanted. There was no difference. But even as these thoughts rolled through his head, his pace had started to lessen. He stopped to catch his breath, then turned to look behind him. Either he had been running longer than he thought, or the tunnel somehow threw off one's perceptions, for it seemed he was far away from where he'd started. The sight of the battle was nothing but a dim blur in the distance. Something held him there, transfixed, something fighting against his natural inclination to keep on running, and it took him a moment to work out just what it was. It was the same something that had prompted him to tell Commander Ongard about Miranda's mental ability, thus saving her from the slaughter at the camp. The thing that had made him fight to keep his hold on Charlie's mind in the castle and had prompted him to take action and shoot Everclear. Now it was telling him to go back because, of all the rotten things he'd done in his life, leaving Miranda behind to die without even trying to help was the one thing that would keep him up at night. Somewhere, somehow, despite all that had happened, he had fallen in love with her without even realizing it. It struck him now, leaving him feeling dazed and disoriented. Well, shit. How did that happen? He didn't know, but it left him with no choice. I must be crazy, he muttered, as he trotted back toward the fight. 14. When Charlie plunged into the void, his only thought was that Grant was in trouble. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the others could be in danger as well, and he thought he felt the Shadowhounds respond to that. The two now racing at his side gave him hope it was true, because he would not go back without Grant. It didn't register on him how strange it was that he could see when there was no discernible source of light in the sky, if sky it was inky black. All his concentration was spent on following the sound of Grant's screams and staying on his feet. The ground was not flat, but rolled up and down with black hills pitted here and there with deep craters. Jagged mountains rose up somewhere off in the distance. The air had a thick, oppressive feel to it. Charlie's sneakers made a hollow thumping sound as he ran. Even with his magic to fuel his speed, he could barely keep the wraith in sight. Beside him, the hounds glided through the air, their paws inches off the ground as they paced him. Fear was an acid taste in his mouth as the sound of his brother's cries grew weaker. Then the wraith dropped Grant, letting him fall several feet to the ground where the low hills began to flatten out. Charlie put on an added burst of speed, pushing his magic until red tinted the edges of his vision. Until he outstripped even the hounds. He had almost reached Grant when some invisible force slammed into his chest and flung him back several feet, sending him sliding across the ground. Under normal circumstances he might have been hurt, but his magic ran so hot in his veins he easily bounced back to his feet, not even winded. A shadowhound stood on either side of him, red eyes glowing, muscles bunched in preparation to attack. The air before Charlie began to swirl with little dots of sparkling light, out of which a figure slowly formed. The figure of a girl about his age, with the slanted brown eyes of an elf and long, silver blonde hair pulled back in a braid to reveal a pair of pointed ears. She smiled at him. "Hello, Charlie." Charlie's mouth fell open. "Lily?" He took a step forward before he could stop himself. No, this could not be Lily. Lily was dead. He had watched her die with his own two eyes, and though he'd seen her once inside his mind, there was no reason why she should be here. "Don't doubt your own eyes, Charlie." She even sounded like Lily. "It's really me." Grant groaned. Charlie glanced at him, relieved he was alive, but still worried. Then let me pass. Of course. She stepped aside and Charlie kept a wary eye on her as he sidled over to Grant. Charlie knelt beside Grant, careful not to put his back to the thing that looked and sounded like Lily but could not be. The hounds stared at her with their muscles tensed. Which only gave him more proof this thing was something not to be trusted. Somehow it had managed to delve into his mind without alerting his magic and seize on the one thing meant to most unnerve him. There was a time when it would have, but he had changed since then. Now that he and the dragon were truly one, he could see things a little more clearly. There were 2 long slashes on both Grant's shoulders and his shirt was wet with blood, but his eyes were open and when Charlie spoke his name, he turned his head toward him. What happened? You were attacked, Charlie said. Here, let's see if you can sit up. He put his arm under Grant's back and helped him into a seated position. Oh, my back. He grimaced, caught sight of Lily, and frowned. Who's that? My name is Lily. I'm a friend of Charlie's. I can help you. She took a step toward him. No, Charlie put himself between her and Grant. I don't know who or what you are, but you are not Lily. Charlie, please, there's no time. She looked fearfully toward the mountains. There are creatures here who want blood, especially yours. And your friends are under attack. You have to go back to them. I don't believe you. But he felt his resolve wavering. Could she really be Lily? She had come to him in his mind after she was dead and helped him become one with the magic inside him. Was it so impossible for her to be here, now? Who knew what could happen in a place like this? She looked at him sadly. Do you remember as I lay dying, how I gave you a piece of my magic and promised you I would always be with you? I meant those words. You have to let me help you. Charlie hesitated. There were certainly ways she could have found that out if she was a mind reader. Why are you here? To help. Charlie, you are in great danger here. But I can protect you. Give me the disc, she held her hand out, and I'll keep it safe for you until you find the catacombs. I can hide it where the Dark Ones will never find it and they'll stop chasing you. They want the disc? Why? To keep you from freeing the magic, of course. It's taken the Dark Ones a long time to get a foothold in this world and they don't want the White Dragon to wake up and ruin things. White Dragon? Charlie had never heard the magic called such, though the word stirred something inside him. What White Dragon? What are you talking about? Never mind all that now. Just give me the disc. An impatient tone had crept into her voice. And was it just his imagination, or were her eyes slowly turning red? I don't have it. Her smile slipped. What do you mean, you don't have it? That's an ancient artifact, not some trinket to be left lying around anywhere you please. Where is it? I left it in the tunnel when I came after Grant. Damn. Now her smile was entirely gone and yes, her eyes were definitely turning red. Well, go and get it. I'll watch Grant until you come back. Charlie, Grant said, pushing himself to his feet, I don't think this person is who she says she is. Me neither. Charlie eyed Lily narrowly. Who are you really? She gave an agitated sigh. I told them this wouldn't work. But would they listen? No. Of course not. And look, I was right, just like I was right when the dragon started dreaming and I told them it could only mean trouble. But nobody ever listens to me. That's the curse of being the youngest. I told them I was no good at the subtle approach. I prefer to be more direct. As she spoke, she began to change. One hand became a gnarled claw covered in coal-black scales and tipped in long, sharp claws. Her eyes widened, becoming red, pupil-less things. 2 curved horns sprouted up from her head. Now, she said, her voice a mixture of Lily's soft lilt and a deep growl. purple lips drew back over sharp fangs. "Get me the disc before I rip your guts out through your nose." Charlie swallowed. "I don't think I will." The creature blinked. "You don't think you will?" "Well, obviously I'm not inspiring the proper amount of terror. Perhaps I should revert completely to my true form, see if you," she grimaced, pressing her lily hand to the side of her head. "What is this?" Her red eyes narrowed to slits. "Intruder? How dare you?" Charlie and Grant exchanged a glance, then bolted around either side of the creature. They ran back the way they had come in hopes of finding the tunnel. The shadowhounds were right beside them. A mighty roar sounded behind them, but they didn't look back. They kept on running as fast as they could. Or at least as fast as Grant could. Charlie would not use his magic and risk leaving his brother behind. Then the tunnel was in sight, a bright white glow in the dark, and as they leapt through, all Charlie could think was he hoped that thing, whatever it was, couldn't follow them. 15. When Thomas arrived back at the battle zone, he found things had deteriorated greatly in his short absence. Mish and Raven were the only ones still on their feet, and from the looks of them only just. Dead elves and shadowhounds littered the ground. Pierce and Miranda were crouched protectively around Peter, and they were both bleeding from cuts inflicted by the wraiths, which fairly blackened the air. Thomas didn't know what he could do but die here. Without the drugs, his mental ability wasn't good for anything but broadcasting, at least so far as he knew, and he doubted that would help much in this situation. This was stupid. It was pointless to die this way. Miranda raised her head and their eyes met. Thomas saw again the look she had given him when he saved her from Everclear. It wasn't the way she looked at Charlie, but it was something. Nobody had ever looked at him that way before. Nobody had ever made him want to try even when things felt hopeless. A look like that might be worth dying for. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on finding someone within the wraiths he could work against. Back at the castle, he had forced Duncan to drop his gun when he was threatening Miranda, and he had been half dead then. Of course, he'd also still had some of the drugs in his system. Now he was stronger, but without the boost the drugs could give. Still, he would try. For her. At first he could find nothing in the darkness, not even the faintest spark of life, suggesting to him that either these creatures had no will, or he simply could not reach them. Then his mind brushed up against something so inhuman it recoiled from the contact. He forced the connection anyway, desperate to do something. Anything. The darkness came alive with a malevolent presence that writhed and snarled under his probing. Some of its thoughts spilled across him, telling him this creature, this dark one, could not pass through the Magestone-created tunnel. It was sending lesser creatures through to attack the others while it tried to get the disc from Charlie. Yes, the disc. The thought slithered across Thomas's mind with a dry rustle. Test not your strength against mine. Give me the disc and be set free. Resist me and die. Thomas smiled into the dark, knowing this thing would never let them leave, even if he handed over the disc. Sorry, no can do. The Dark One roared out its fury. Then it attacked, slamming its will against Thomas's and trying to drive him out. It was strong. So strong. But Thomas held on, seeking a way to force it to release its hold over the wraiths. He dug himself deeper into the Dark One's mind. Mental claws raked across his consciousness, filling him with a red-hot pain the likes of which he'd never before felt. Still, he clung stubbornly to his tenuous hold and drove his will further down through layers of black bile that burned and stung. Fighting for control. The Dark One cried out as Thomas struck a vulnerable spot, wounding it. It lost its grip on the wraiths. But in doing so it freed itself to turn the full power of its fury on Thomas. Before he could escape, he found himself entangled in the web of the Dark One's mind as it grabbed at him. It was furious he had won even so small a victory and intent on making certain he didn't live to enjoy it. Fresh waves of pain rolled over Thomas. He struggled to break free, but it was no good. He had used up all his strength and now he was drowning. He was suffocating. He was dying. Somewhere above him, crimson light burned in the darkness. A flicker of flames that grew brighter as a red dragon hurtled toward him, spewing fire along the way. The Dark One shuddered and released its hold on Thomas. It withdrew further inside itself in an effort to protect the core of its being from this new, more powerful onslaught. But the dragon did not pursue. It spread its wings to halt its suicide dive, gently gathered Thomas up into its claws, and carried him out of the darkness and into the light. 16. A shrieking wraith racked its long claws across Miranda's arm as she made her way toward Pierce and Peter. She cried out, dropped to all fours, and started to crawl. The wraiths seemed to be staying higher off the ground. Within the protective circle of Pierce's arms, Peter was still and silent. "Is he hurt?" Miranda asked. "No, just terrified." Pierce's glasses were askew and there were 3 long scratches down his right cheek. "Where's Thomas?" "He ran away." Miranda knew she should be neither surprised nor hurt by the fact, but she was. "There's nothing he could do to help anyway." Pierce nodded silently. She could see in his eyes he was thinking the same thing she was. They were losing this fight. The scents of blood and death were all around them as more and more of the shrieking wraiths filled the tunnel and there seemed to be nothing any of them could do. "Charlie will come back," she said, laying her hand on Pierce's arm. "He has to. Otherwise he'll die and all will be lost." But maybe that was going to happen. Maybe they would all die here and the magic would remain lost and the world would burn. For the first time in all this, she had to concede there was a chance they might fail. They huddled there together for what seemed the longest time, then Miranda had the strangest sensation of eyes on her back. She lifted her head and met Thomas's gaze. A wild surge of hope rushed through her, though she didn't know what he might be able to do. Their gazes held for a moment. Thomas closed his eyes. As Miranda watched, Thomas's face furrowed in lines of concentration. Then his expression grew slack and he collapsed. Miranda glanced at Pierce and Peter, then rushed toward Thomas. A shadowhound snarling and snapping at her side kept the wraiths at bay. She dropped to her knees by Thomas's side and took hold of one of his hands, anxiously watching his face. His eyes rolled wildly beneath his closed lids. She squeezed his hand. "I don't know what you're doing, but I believe in you." Thomas moaned, his face twisting in a grimace of pain. If she could have done anything to help, she would have. But she could only sit there helpless as sweat broke out across his brow. His body trembled. Suddenly silence filled the tunnel. Miranda looked up to find the wraiths had gone. Raven, Mish, Pierce, and Peter stood among the carnage, expressions varying from shock to wary unease. They were bloodied, but alive. "Thanks to Thomas. You did it." Miranda looked down at him. "You saved us." But what a terrible toll it had taken. Thomas's skin was ashen, his breath coming in short, rasping gasps. A single drop of blood rolled out of the corner of his left eye, like a tear. Miranda laid a hand on his chest and felt his heart struggling to beat. A heavy feeling hit her as she realized he was dying. Charlie and Grant came through the tunnel wall, panting, and stopped when they saw the carnage. Miranda caught Charlie's eye and he hurried over to her. Grant followed more slowly behind. "Is he dead?" Grant asked, his voice hollow and toneless. "Not yet." Miranda looked imploringly at Charlie. "Can't you do anything?" "I don't know how, but he saved our lives." "I can try." He knelt beside Thomas, laid his hands on either side of the older boy's head, and closed his eyes. There was a moment of profound silence, of stillness, as they waited to see what would happen. Thomas opened his eyes. The whites were all streaked with red and for a moment it seemed as if he could not see them. He took a ragged breath, and focused his gaze on Charlie. "It's okay." Charlie smiled down at him. "You're all right. You're safe. I don't know what happened here, but Miranda says you helped, so you have my thanks. Thomas's gaze shifted to Miranda. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. Tears for me? That has to be a first. She laughed shakily. You deserve them. He gave her an odd look. Do I? You did good, Grant said. I don't know what you did, exactly, but I can see it was good. I'm proud of you. Thomas dropped his hand to his chest and sighed. Yeah? So why do I feel like shit? Again. Because you almost died, Charlie said. That thing, I don't know what it was, but we heard it and I'd bet it's pretty mad at us right about now. I think we better get out of here before it recovers. Pierce, Grant said, would you see if you can round up the wagon? I don't think Thomas is in any shape to walk right now. Thomas isn't in any shape for anything right now, Thomas said. He sat up with a moan. I feel like my head is split wide open. Shit, that was stupid. It was brave. On an impulse, Miranda leaned over and kissed his cheek. You're a hero. I've been called a lot of things, but never that. He grinned at her. It was the first time she had ever seen him genuinely smile. It made him look younger, somehow. At times she forgot he was only a few years older than she was. That's what you are. My hero. Yeah, well, let's not make a big deal out of it. Okay? But it was obvious he was pleased by her praise. She smiled back at him. Okay. 17. Charlie was back in the lead, carrying the staff and the disc and hoping wherever the Dark One was, she was too hurt to send anything else after them. He had been relieved when Thomas told him the Dark Ones could not come into the tunnel, but that didn't mean the one they had faced, or perhaps one of the others, couldn't attack them in some other way. The sooner they were free of the void, the better. He didn't know how far they would have to go or even how they would know if they had reached their destination. But Lily, the real Lily, had told him when she gave him the disc that it was both the map and the key to the catacombs, and he supposed he simply had to trust it would show them the way. Time passed, though he couldn't have said how much. He saw a golden glow ahead that was not part of the tunnel. A thrill of excitement ran through him. Look! I think I see daylight. It's about time, Raven said. I'm sick of this place. The others rode in the wagon, which Pierce had found and brought back to them. One of the ponies had been hurt by a stray bullet, but not seriously so. The faint smell of honeysuckle filled the air, and the ponies quickened their pace without need of Grant's urging. Soon, Charlie saw a field of green grass waving underneath a blue sky and felt his spirits lift. This was it. He could feel it in his bones. They were finally here. Charlie stepped out of the tunnel into the blazing heat of a midday sun. To his left, the prairie stretched out as far as the eye could see, an endless wave of green broken only by the faint twinkle of a distant river. To his right, tall, rocky hills dotted with trees cast their shade upon the ground. Between two of these hills was a tree-lined path, and Charlie needed no foresight to tell him what lay at the end of it. This is it, Charlie said. We're here. He laid the staff just inside the tunnel to hold it in case they had a need to go back that way, but kept the disc in his hand. Come on, Miranda, let's go. He could feel the call of the magic stronger than ever, humming pleasantly along his nerves, and he was eager to reach it. Wait a minute. Grant climbed down from the wagon seat. I want to come, too. Somebody has to keep the two of you out of trouble. Charlie started to object. After all, in his dreams he always came to the cave alone. But it felt right, somehow, the three of them together. As it should be. And he would be glad enough for the company. Okay. Miranda stepped up beside him and slipped her warm hand into his. It's going to be okay, Charlie. No matter what happens from here on out, it'll all be okay. You'll release the magic and you'll stop the war. I know you will. He squeezed her hand and smiled. For the first time since this whole thing started, he believed she was right. It was going to be okay. He was meant for great things. His heart still hurt for the loss of Spree, but just let everything else go right and he could bear it. The path between the trees was narrow, so they started down it single file, Charlie in the lead, followed by Miranda then Grant. It worried Charlie some to leave the others, but Thomas needed rest and someone had to stay behind to watch over him. Besides, they had no way of knowing what might yet lie ahead of them. It was cooler beneath the shade of the trees and Charlie felt his tension begin to ease, replaced by a growing sense of excitement and anticipation that drove away all his worry and doubt. Halfway down the path, the ground changed from gently sloping dirt to a series of stone steps leading down into the valley. The roar of a waterfall filled the air, the scent sharp and clean. They came off the steps and into the forest, where mottled patches of light and shadow lay upon the ground. The waterfall cascaded down the side of the hill, sending a fine spray of mist into the air as it joined the brook. Charlie could hardly believe he was really here. It seemed impossible he should truly be walking in a place that had filled his dreams for so many years. Miranda took his hand again as they approached the brook. On the other side, the yawning mouth of the cave awaited. Somewhere inside the darkness lay the lost magic. The brook was narrow and shallow. They had no trouble crossing it, though they soaked their feet in the process. Then they stood at the mouth of the cave that was the entrance to the silver catacombs. "We're here." Charlie shook his head in wonder. "This is so weird." "I know," Grant said. "I have to confess, I wasn't always sure we would make it." "Neither was I. But we did." Then, much to his surprise, he heard someone call his name. He turned with a frown, wondering who in their group would have followed them and why. A sound like thunder echoed off the hills. 18. As soon as Charlie, Miranda, and Grant were out of sight, Thomas sat up in the back of the wagon. The action made him dizzy and he had to pause for a moment to let the feeling pass. The others watched the path, paying him no mind whatsoever. That was good. Not so good that Grant and Miranda had gone with Charlie, but nothing to be done about it now. Maybe nothing to be done, period, if Ezel and Herendine were not still following them. He stared at the tunnel, waiting, trying to build up his strength. Coming so close to death had drained him, but maybe not too much to do what needed to be done. The thought bore a trace of guilt. Something he wasn't used to feeling. He guessed he owed Charlie a lot, even his life, but that didn't change the way he felt about him. It was too bad Miranda would have to be there when it happened, but she would never love him anyway. Even if she had called him her hero. He really wished she hadn't done that. It didn't help with the guilt. For a moment, he found himself thinking about what he was about to do and wondering if there might not be some other way. It hadn't crossed his mind before, but now as he sat there waiting, he thought of how Ezel had promised to make him king. But what about Grant? Would she want him to kill both his brothers? Could he even do that? He wasn't sure. He felt a lot of animosity toward Grant, jealousy too, but he didn't hate him the way he hated Charlie. Then he saw Ezel and a dozen Undine striding down the tunnel toward him and he knew he had a choice. He could call out and warn the others before the elves got to them. Or he could do what he had set out to do in the beginning and add one more betrayal to the long list. Thomas slipped out of wagon and edged away from it. One of the shadowhounds caught the motion and turned, growling. It drew the attention of the others as Ezel and Herendine stepped out of the tunnel. Mish frowned at his sister. "Ezel?" He looked at the others standing behind her, their weapons in hand. "What are you doing here?" She smiled as aimed her rod at him. "Taking back what's mine. What you stole from me." The other elves fanned out around her. Both shadowhounds were growling now, and they were both looking at Thomas, which did not make him feel too good. Ezel, whatever it is you can do about those hounds, it might be a good time to do it." The elf continued to stare at her brother as if she had not heard him. The hounds bunched their muscles and leapt at Thomas. "Ezel!" He stumbled back and felt a sharp pain in his chest as one of the hounds scratched him with its claws. Ezel barked out a few words he couldn't understand, and the two hounds fell dead at his feet. Thomas touched a hand to his chest. His fingers came away wet with blood. He glowered at her. "Cut that a little close, didn't you?" "Sorry, I was distracted." She looked him up and down. "You look terrible." "Yeah, well, I had a little run-in with a big nasty in the tunnel." "Can you do something about it?" "Of course. We are partners after all." She came to him and put her hand on his forehead. A renewed sense of strength and vigor rushed through Thomas as his wounds, both mental and physical, were healed. If you had to be aligned with an elf, it didn't hurt to partner up with one who could do something like that. Ezel spoke a word and one of her elves brought Pierce's rifle, which they had left behind at the compound, to Thomas. Mish stared at the dead hounds, then at his sister. "What is this? You used the forbidden magic, Ezel? How could you?" "Don't be such a child," Ezel said with a sneer. "The old ways and laws are dead, like this city. Like we will be if we do not escape this place. You are just like father, stuck in yesterday. Well, it's a new dawn, my brother, and if we want to rise to meet it, we must be willing to do whatever it takes. Now get out of the wagon. All of you." The elves bound all but Mish's hands with thin silver rope and drew them together beside the wagon. Raven glared at Thomas. "I knew you'd pull something like this. Charlie should have killed you a long time ago." Thomas sauntered over to her with a smile. "You know what? I never did like you." He turned the rifle around and slammed the butt end into Raven's gut. She doubled over with a groan and fell to her knees. "This will do you no good," Mish said. He stood at the end of the wagon, facing his sister. "It won't change the fact that father chose me over you. He could see the truth in you I never could. Father was a fool." Ezel lifted her rod. "And so are you." A blue bolt of light struck Mish in the chest. He stumbled back, then toppled over face first into the grass. She turned away before his body even hit the ground. "Come, Thomas. Let us finish this, Dot." "Thomas, don't," Pierce said. "They're your brothers. All the more reason why I should be the one to pull the trigger. If Ezel could kill her brother, he could certainly kill his. Let it not be said an elf woman had more nerve than he did." Thomas and Ezel followed the narrow path until they reached the stone steps, then slipped off into the trees. The sound of the waterfall was loud. It filled up Thomas's head. His heart beat fast, but his hands were steady. They moved beneath the shade of the trees until they came to a slight rise that overlooked an open space with a little brook running down the center of it. Charlie, Miranda, and Grant crossed the brook only moments later. They stopped at the entrance to a cave and Thomas could see Charlie and Grant talking, though he could not make out the words. "Now," Ezel whispered, her breath warm against his ear, "before they enter the cave." Thomas took the little spyglass out of his pocket and fitted it into his eye. He lifted the rifle to his shoulder and thumbed the switch to change it from multiple rounds to single shot. He felt calm and cool as he gazed down the sights at Charlie's back. But that was no good. He wanted Charlie to see what was coming. To know who was ending his life. "Charlie!" He had to shout to be heard over the waterfall. Charlie turned at the sound of his name, confusion clear on his face as he looked to see who had called his name. With a smile, Thomas pulled the trigger. 19. Miranda took Charlie's hand again as they approached the brook and hoped he could not feel the unsteady beat of her heart through her fingers. The moment from her dream was fast approaching. She knew what needed to be done, but it was still a hard thing. The water was cold against her bare feet as they crossed the brook. She savored the feel of it, as she savored the little rainbows created by the tumbling waterfall, and the cool, clear scent of the air. If you had to die, this was not a bad place in which to do it. As they approached the cave, Charlie slipped his hand out of hers. She wished she could hold on a little longer, but it was not to be. Miranda turned to scan the trees in the area where she had stood in her vision. Her eyes searched for any clue as to where the shot would come from. There, a flicker of red light among the trees, as if the sun reflected off a piece of colored glass. Someone called Charlie's name, the sound barely audible over the rush of the waterfall, and her heart jumped. From the corner of her eye, Miranda saw Charlie turn, as he had in her vision, searching for whoever had called his name. She didn't think about it, she just threw herself in front of him as a sound like thunder echoed off the hills. Something kicked her in the chest and she was looking through a haze of red as she fell. It took one painful breath to realize it was her hair streaming out in front of her. Time seemed to slow as a steady, white-hot pain rolled across her nerves. Her head was filled up with the sound of screaming, but it seemed to come from a long way away. She felt the touch of hands on her arms, then she was lying on the ground, staring up at the blue sky. Cold seeped into her bones and she was afraid. She tried to call out to Charlie, but her throat was too filled with coppery blood and the word came out as nothing but a wet gurgle. Was he alive? Had she saved him? She didn't know. The rush of blood pounding in her ears would have blocked out the sound of more shots. She thought to turn her head to look, but it was much too heavy. Someone brushed the hair back from her face, touching her cheek, and she thought it must be Charlie. She struggled to focus her gaze. If she was going to die, at least she could see him and know her death had counted for something. Tears spilled down her cheeks, giving her a clear view of the person kneeling beside her. And as the darkness closed in around her, the last thing Miranda saw was Thomas. 20. Charlie heard the sound and he saw Miranda jerk back. He even caught her as she fell. But it was not until he saw the blood spreading across the front of her shirt that he realized what had happened. A wordless scream erupted from his lips. "The cave, Charlie," Grant yelled, trying to pull him away. "Get in the cave." But he couldn't go. He couldn't leave her. He tried to hold on, but she was slipping through his fingers even as his heart shattered into a million pieces. Grant wrapped his arms around Charlie's chest and bodily lifted him up. Charlie struggled as Miranda fell to the ground. He kicked and screamed, trying to free himself from Grant's grip. Grant carried him into the dank darkness of the cave, moving far from the entrance, holding Charlie so tight. "Stop it," he said, his voice firm. "She's dead, Charlie. There's nothing we can do." Charlie moaned. He wouldn't hear such words. He couldn't. What would be the point in breathing if she was dead? It was too much for him to bear. But in his heart, he knew it was true. He stopped struggling, going limp in Grant's arms as tears rolled freely down his face. "You have to go on," Grant said. "You have to free the magic." For a moment, the words bounced around Charlie's head without meaning. Then he realized he was still clutching the disc in his hand, so hard it bit into his flesh. Stupid, useless thing, all it had done was bring him misery. He wanted to drop it, to fling it away, but the muscles in his hand refused to obey. A soft whimper escaped his lips. "Listen to me," Grant said. "Everything that has happened up until this moment has been to get you here. If you give up now, if you fall to pieces, everything we've done counts for nothing. Miranda's death counts for nothing. Is that what you want?" Charlie closed his eyes, wishing he could float away on a dark cloud to the place without pain. But even now the magic called to him and its pull was strong. He took a ragged breath. "No." "Then go." Grant released him. "Go now, Dot." Charlie stumbled forward a few steps, then turned to face him. "But, you aren't coming with me?" Grant's face was set and determined. "Whoever was shooting at us will probably try to follow you. I'll do what I can to buy you some time, but you better hurry." The impact of those words hit him hard. Grant would stay behind and probably die like Miranda had died. Like Spree. He didn't know if he could stand to lose another person he loved. Some of those feelings must have shone through in his eyes, because Grant gave him a small, tight smile. "This isn't about us. Any of us," Grant said. "It's about stopping my father from destroying the world. No sacrifice is too great for that. Miranda knew it, and so do I. So do you. And he did know it, even if he didn't want to." Goodbye stuck behind the lump in Charlie's throat. He turned away, knowing this was probably the last time he would ever see his brother alive, and moved forward into the dark. Alone. His hand throbbed from the sharp sides of the disc digging into his skin, and he could feel a sticky wetness there, but he didn't loosen his hold. Let it hurt. Let it bleed. Why not? Why shouldn't he spill some of his own blood for this dream when so many others had? Blue light had been glowing around Charlie for some time before he became aware of it. He had no idea how long he'd been walking, or how far into the cave he might have gone. He looked over his shoulder, but all he could see beyond the glow was darkness. Ahead, the glow illuminated a towering stone door in the cave wall. The door was covered all over in strange words and symbols. Charlie stared at it, trying to make some sense of the confusion. Trying to find some clue as to what he was supposed to do. Then he spotted an indentation the same size as the disc. Charlie lifted his hand and slowly opened his stiff fingers. Blood was splattered across the silver surface of the disc. He stared at it for a long moment, pressed the disc into the indentation, and held his breath. Nothing happened. He sighed. Now what? The markings on the door gave him no answer. Taking a deep breath, he tried to push all the turmoil and anguish from his mind. It wasn't easy, but after a moment, he felt his magic begin burning through him. The dragon filled him up, chasing everything else away. Warm, red light seeped out through his skin, overwhelming the cool blue glow. Charlie stared in rapt fascination as flames danced along his fingers. It seemed as if it were someone else lifting his arm, pressing the palm of his hand against the magestone. The fire leapt from him into the stone, chasing its way across the symbols on the door until they pulsed with the heat of it. A resounding boom shook dirt from the ceiling as the disc snapped in two, sending a crack up and down the middle of the door. Charlie hesitated, then laid the palms of his hands against the stone and pushed. The door opened. 21. Thomas saw Miranda looking up at him, and he knew what she was going to do even as he pulled the trigger. But it was too late to stop the bullet. Too late to change the course of fate. Miranda jerked back as the bullet struck her chest. Then she fell into Charlie's arms. The sound of his screams rang through the air. Shoot again. Before they flee into the cave, Ezel said. When Thomas made no move to do so, she grabbed his arm and gave him a little shake. Shoot them. But Grant, partly carrying and partly dragging a struggling Charlie, was already retreating into the black mouth of the cave. Thomas could not have shot anyway. He was frozen by a sudden, gripping horror at what he had done. When his mother had died, Thomas had thought there could never be a moment more painful, more filled with loss. This was 1,000 times worse. His grip tightened around the gun unconsciously as he stared down at Miranda's still form. Ezel muttered a curse as she started down the slope. After a moment, Thomas slowly followed, a numb, hollow sensation filling him. The elf woman went to the mouth of the cave and peered inside, while Thomas stared down at the blood pooling on the ground beneath Miranda. Then he saw her chest lift and fall and realized she was still alive. Dropping to his knees beside her, Thomas brushed her long red hair from her face and touched her cheek. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. That he hadn't meant it. But his throat was too tight. It felt as if someone was driving hot nails into his heart. The strength of the pain shocked and unnerved him. Miranda's tears spilled across his finger and, for far too brief a moment, her green eyes gazed up at him, widening slightly as if in surprise. Then her eyelids fluttered shut. A surge of desperation welled up in Thomas as he rose to his feet. We must hurry, Ezel said, coming over to him. We must not allow Charlie to reach the magic alive. Thomas hardly heard the words. Heal her. What? Ezel frowned down at Miranda. We haven't the time for. Heal her, Thomas said, grabbing hold of the woman's arm. Ezel tried to pull away. There is no time. If Charlie reaches the magic before us, we'll be unable to stop him. Thomas brought the rifle up and pressed the barrel against her stomach. Make the time. Frowning, Ezel knelt beside Miranda and placed her hands on either side of the bullet wound. Her pale white hands were quickly marred red with blood. Thomas hovered over them, filled with an all-consuming anxiety. And a need. The need for her to be all right. After only a fraction of a second, Ezel sat back on her heels. There is nothing I can do. What do you mean? He pointed the rifle at her head. Heal her. Shoot me if you will. It will do no good. I cannot raise the dead. No, a great deal of anguish was wrapped around that single word. She's not dead. I don't believe you. Try again. Try harder. It would be pointless. Ezel rose to her feet. Why do you weep for this girl? She was not yours. Nor would she ever have been. We must go after Charlie. That is what matters. Charlie. Always Charlie. Everything was always about Charlie. All the pain and the grief and the jealousy and 1,000 other emotions that twisted and twined around each other all swept over Thomas in a blinding wave. His fingers tightened around the trigger and Ezel went down with a shocked expression on her face. Thomas. He whirled toward the sound of Grant's voice. His brother stood at the dark entrance to the cave, a sad, almost pitying look on his face. Thomas could not stand such a look. He would have preferred anger and hatred. Give me the gun, Thomas. You've done enough. I don't think I have. He leveled the gun at Grant's chest. Tears blurred his vision. Move aside. Grant slowly shook his head. You'll have to shoot me. You'd die for that elf blood? The word came out thick and choked. Why not? Miranda did. Thomas winced. He needed to focus on Charlie now. On his hatred. Not on the blinding pain that hovered just at the back of his mind, threatening to consume him. Fine. You chose Charlie over me a long time ago. So did she. I don't care. I don't need you. I don't need her. I don't need anybody. Now move aside or I swear I will shoot you. Tears rolled slowly down his cheeks. Try to be sensible for once in your life, Grant said. I know you have no more love for our father's plans than I do. Charlie can stop him and we can help. Thomas laughed bitterly. Right. Charlie gets to be a big hero and you get to be king. Where does that leave me? Out in the cold. Like always. I know how it works. Fine. Then what about this? Grant advanced several steps out into the sunlight. Miranda was your friend. The only one you had. She cared about you. She believed in you. She saw something in you no one else could see. Not even me. Stop. Thomas said. His hands had begun to shake. Grant advanced yet further. She believed somewhere inside you was a good man. Was she wrong? He wrapped his hands around the barrel of the gun. If she was, pull the trigger. But if she was right, if you cared about her at all, don't let her death be for nothing. She didn't jump in front of that bullet to save Charlie. She did it because she had a cause she believed in with all her heart. If you loved her, you have to care about something she was willing to die for. A confused and bewildered sense of loss for something that was never his washed over Thomas. He released his hold on the rifle as he struggled to find some sense inside his own mind. This could not go on. He would not lose himself to confusion and pain. It wasn't in his nature. He lifted his head and met Grant's eyes. "I still hate Charlie." "I know." Grant tossed the rifle aside. "But this isn't about Charlie." Thomas snorted. "Could have fooled me." He glanced down at Miranda and a tight band constricted around his heart. "I'd take it back, if I could." "I know that, too." The sound of frightened shouts beyond the valley caught their attention. They exchanged a look, splashed across the brook, and raced through the trees toward the stone steps. Grant took the lead, in more of a rush to get back to the others than Thomas was. There was a lot going through his head at the moment. He needed time to figure it all out. They came out from the path and skidded to a halt. In the sky above them, a dragon circled, its ebony scales glittering in the sunlight. Red Eyes gazed down at them and Thomas felt a thrill of fear. This was the Dark One whose mind he had invaded, he felt sure of it. The dragon's eyes focused on him and there was nothing but pure hatred there. "Hurry, help me." Grant rushed toward the others, who cowered down beside the wagon, and quickly went to work untying Raven's hands. "Thomas." Thomas swallowed, ignoring his brother as he gazed up at the dragon. "Well," he muttered. "That's not something you see every day." For the moment, the dragon was making lazy circles in the sky, but when it decided to attack they were going to be in some deep shit. The Undine gibbered at each other in their native tongue, staring at the dragon and gripping their weapons. No doubt trying to decide how wise it would be to fire on the beast. Grant and Raven untied Pierce and Peter, then came back to where Thomas stood near the path. Before anybody could say a word, Raven hauled off and punched Thomas straight in the mouth, sending him sprawling. She stood over him, her eyes bright with fury, and said, "You son of a bitch! Where are Miranda and Charlie?" "Stop." Grant grabbed her arm and pulled her away from him. "There's no time for that now. We have bigger worries." He looked pointedly at the dragon. As if his words were a cue, the void began to twist and swirl, and in a moment, the black dragon was joined by 8 more of her kind. The panicked Undine fired bolts of blue energy at the beasts, and in return were fried to a crisp when the lead dragon belted a stream of fire back at them. "Now might be a good time to run," Thomas suggested as he pushed himself to his feet. "I know of a handy cave we could hide in." Grant said something in reply, but a great rumbling from within the forest drowned out the sound of his voice. An explosion of leaves and branches flew through the air as a fiery form hurtled into the sky. 22. Charlie stepped through the doors and onto a stone ledge that overlooked a deep, wide cavern, the roof of which lay far above and was hidden in shadow. The rest of the cavern was lit by the same cool blue glow as had radiated from the walls outside. And there, at least 50 feet below where he stood, a white dragon was curled up upon the stone. The magic inside Charlie burned as he stared down at the source of his power. At the one who had called out to him through time and space and woken the fiery dragon within. It was time to return the favor. As Charlie followed the stone steps toward the floor of the cavern, he felt a change come over him. Bits and pieces of himself began to fall away. Thoughts of his friends, those lost and those yet with him, of home, of family, melted away. The pain, the anger, the loss, receded. Replaced by a sense of jubilation. Of accomplishment. Of coming home. It was for this moment he had been born. A series of tunnels radiated out from the chamber, the silver catacombs, where magic flowed out into the worlds that circled this place. For once he had stepped through those doors, he had left the city of magic behind and entered the center of the universe. Memories that were not his own swirled around inside Charlie's head. They were quick and confused and dominated by images of war. And running all through them like a river was a wave of weariness. The white dragon had slept long, dormant and silent. Then it had begun to dream, to seek out the one who would take its place and continue the circle. It had found Charlie. The first in 1,000 years to be born with the soul of a dragon. 2 spirits in one body, both struggling to understand their purpose. Now, they were truly and completely one. Charlie allowed the red dragon to suppress much of who he was, because he knew his duty and he knew he could not do it under the burden of so much pain. So he drifted away for a while, becoming an observer, letting the dragon take control. "I've come in answer to your call, Great One." He knelt reverently beside the white dragon. "I've come to wake the dreamer." He laid his hand upon the great scaly forehead. "The worlds have need of you again." The dragon's lids lifted and pale blue eyes stared at him. "No, little one." The words brushed his mind like a gentle caress. "The worlds have need of you. My time is finished. I pass my mantle on to you, as it was passed to me once, long, long ago. I will sleep the dreamless sleep once more. This time for all eternity. Go, and give my gift to the elves of this one's world so it may not be lost. And remember, little one, all worlds belong to you to tend and care for. Meddle not in trifling affairs, but only when great tragedy looms." The white dragon's scales began to glimmer with a pale silver light. It washed over Charlie, filling him with the ancient magic. Then the dragon was gone and he was alone in the vast, echoing chamber. He stood there a moment, his breath slow and steady, until he became aware of a disturbance tugging at the back of his mind. The city of magic was not a world, but only a piece of what the elves here called the old world, which had been broken off to keep the dark ones occupied until the red dragon came. Its loss was regretful, but such things happened at times. It was the world as a whole the dragon was responsible for protecting, and it was time to go back to the one threatened now with destruction. But first, he must deal with the dark ones. 23. Thomas stared up at the fiery red dragon as it unfurled its wings against the sky. He knew it for what it was. He had seen it twice before, though never in the corporeal world. Only in the landscape of the mind. What it meant for Charlie, he didn't know and he didn't really care. What it meant for himself, however, was certainly a point of interest. The black dragons faced the red, who seemed terribly outnumbered. Yet it was the red that attacked first. It dove with lightning speed into the midst of the blacks, slashing with its claws and spewing fire. The blacks scattered under this unexpected assault and Thomas had the feeling they had not expected such fierce opposition from the red. "You want to know where Charlie is?" Thomas asked Raven. "I'll give you one guess." Her face paled as she realized what he meant. "That's impossible." Peter's eyes went wide. "Charlie's a dragon?" "I think he always was." The dragons continued to fight above them, and soon blood rained from the sky. Thomas and the others were forced to retreat under the relative safety of the trees. A black plummeted from the sky, landing on the wagon and ponies with a thump that made the ground roll. Despite being outnumbered, the red was more than holding its own. It was winning. Another black fell, landing on top of the first. The others seemed to get a little smarter after that. They broke away from the red and circled the smaller dragon. As two blacks engaged the red from the front, another slipped in behind and slightly above, crashing into the red's back. The two dragons fell toward the ground in a rolling ball of snapping teeth and slashing claws. The black hit the ground on its back with the red on top. With a quick snap of its jaws, the red tore out the black's throat, threw back its head, and belted out a fireball at another black coming in on it from above. The remaining dragons turned tail and tried to retreat back into the void, but the red was on them in an instant, so fast it was nothing but a streak of red across the sky. In short order the blacks were no more. The red rose a little higher in the sky and blasted the carcasses with a fire so intense the heat pushed Thomas and the others still further down the path. Thomas watched, fascinated, as the black dragons quickly burned away. He began to feel a sense of awe as his gaze turned to the red with its scales burning bright as the fire below it. But more than that was a feeling of fear. For if anything of Charlie was left inside, he might be in serious trouble. When the fire had burned itself away, The red dragon descended to land in the midst of the ash. For a moment it stared at them, its amber eyes glowing. Then little sparkles of light began to dance across its scales. It shrank, drawing in on itself. Its body twisted and changed before their very eyes until, instead of a fiery dragon, there was only Charlie. He staggered and went down on one knee. Raven ran to him, her boots kicking up gray ash, but hesitated just shy of actually touching him. "Charlie?" Breathing hard, Charlie slowly rose to his feet. The dragon's amber eyes regarded them calmly from his face. "I'm all right." The transformation is tiring." Raven looked at him closely. "Who are you?" He sighed. "That is a complicated question and we haven't time for the answer. We have to get to Kiloreen. The war is not going in our favor." "How do we get there?" Grant asked. "I know the way. Follow me." He walked past them and under the trees without so much as a glance at Thomas, which both puzzled and relieved the older boy. They followed Charlie down the path and into the valley. A number of trees had been either uprooted or smashed, no doubt by the dragon's ascent. As they neared the brook, a tight feeling started in Thomas's chest. He had no desire to see Miranda again. But he needn't have worried, because the space between the brook and the cave entrance was scorched. Nothing remained but blackened earth. Thomas opened his mouth and started to ask about Miranda and then decided that might be a very bad idea and snapped it shut again. It was dark in the cave. The light that fell in through the entrance did not illuminate much, nor did it reach further than a few feet inside. Thomas found it unnerving and moved closer to Grant. This whole thing was so crazy. He felt like he was spinning inside. Gradually, the dark gave way to a steady, blue glow emanating from the walls. Soon, this glow lit up an open doorway. As he passed the door, Thomas glanced at the odd symbols and words carved upon the stone. Beyond was a vast, empty chamber. Far below the ledge on which they stood was the floor of the chamber, with many tunnels leading off from it like the spokes of a wheel. As Charlie started down the steps, Grant reached out and touched his arm. "What about the magic?" he asked. "Did you find it?" Charlie touched a hand to his own chest. "It's here. Don't worry, we did what we came here to do. Now we just have to get back." They continued on down to the cavern floor, toward one of the tunnels. The tunnel was not dark, but lit by the same pale blue light as the cavern had been. Here, the same sort of symbols and words as were on the door decorated the walls. Thomas felt a sensation of a great power pressing down on him. The weight of the ages. It made him feel small and insignificant, as if his life was nothing but a pebble in the sea. He could not imagine where such an odd and disquieting thought had come from. One thing was for certain, he did not like this place. Not at all. When they marched wearily out of the tunnel, they found themselves in yet another cavern, this one lit by the familiar glow of magestone energy and filled with tents. Several people, elf-bloods judging by their pointed ears, stopped what they were doing to stare open-mouthed at the new arrivals. A man bearing an automatic rifle approached them, but he didn't point his weapon. He just stared at them, as stunned as the others. "Who, what?" He blinked at the opening behind them, which was slowly closing. "How?" "Find Sylvan," Charlie said. "Tell him Charlie is back and he brings the lost magic." A ripple of shock went through those nearest them. It spread as the word passed like wildfire through the camp. The man turned and ran off to do as Charlie had bid. It was only then the realization sank into Thomas's brain. They were back. Not home, for his home was in Angland, but in Kiloreen. In some kind of elven camp in a cave somewhere. A crowd of wide-eyed elves soon gathered near them at a respectful distance, mostly staring at Charlie. Naturally. Great, more elves. The last thing he wanted to see just now. In fact, all he wanted to see at the moment was something to eat and a bed. Maybe in sleep he could forget the image of Miranda lying on the ground with a gaping hole in her chest. The crowd parted as 3 elves approached them. One had silver hair and eyes and looked remarkably like the elves from the City of Magic, the second had short brown hair and hazel eyes, and the third was a woman with long blonde hair. "Charlie, words cannot express how glad we are to see you," Sylvan said. "I came as soon as I could." Charlie stared steadfastly back at the elf. "I wish it could have been sooner." "So do I." He turned toward the hazel-eyed elf. "Anton, why don't you and Raven fill each other in on what has happened since she and Charlie left us?" Anton glanced at Charlie, then smiled at Raven. "I think that's a good idea." Raven was clearly not eager to leave Charlie's side, but she reluctantly allowed the man to draw her away. "Diana will show the rest of you someplace where you can rest," Sylvan said. "Charlie and I must talk alone." They followed the blonde elf through the crowd and into the heart of the camp. Tents were crammed into the space as tightly as could be managed. Everywhere Thomas looked there were elves, most of them thin and disheveled. Their dark-rimmed eyes wore a haunted look. Refugees was the first word that came to Thomas's mind. But from what? And why were they in a cave? The possibilities were not pleasant. "What's going on?" Grant asked. "Has the war started?" Diana eyed him in a less than friendly manner. "You're friends of Charlie's, so we'll be glad to offer you what meager comforts we can. But I'm not permitted to speak about certain things with just anyone. Not even Angland's crowned prince?" "You must be Grant," she said, looking at him in a new way. "Charlie spoke of you often during his stay with us." "His stay?" A frown line marred Grant's brow. "You mean while he was in Kiloreen?" "Yes." "Didn't he tell you about that?" "There hasn't been time for us to talk. Things have been crazy." "Yes, I know what you mean." She looked around at the camp. "Let's find your friends a place to rest. Then we can talk." "I can't imagine Sylvan would object. Given who you are." "What about me?" Thomas asked. "I'm a prince too. My name is Thomas." "Didn't Charlie ever mention me?" "No. Only Grant." "Figures," he muttered. As usual, it was Charlie and Grant and forget about Thomas. Grant gave him a sharp look. "It's all right. He's my brother." Diana looked uncertain, but agreed. After dropping Pierce and Peter off at a tent where they could get something to eat, she led Grant and Thomas up a flight of stairs to a room with a long wooden table surrounded by a dozen chairs. Maps and charts covered the walls. They sat and Diana folded her slender hands on top of the table. "You are currently in a camp housing a branch of the Elven resistance movement. An organization that has long been working toward the goal of freeing our people and winning back Kiloreen. When Raven found Charlie and we discovered who he was, we knew the time to strike had finally come. We hit the mining camps first, to rescue the elves being forced to mine for mage stones. The attack was coordinated to strike all 12 simultaneously so they wouldn't be able to communicate with each other or with Angland for reinforcements. We took all of them, but many of the soldiers managed to flee through transports which carried them to safety and were shut off so we could not follow. As far as the king knows, no transports between Kiloreen and Angland are currently operational. There is one, however, that was hidden near King's City by a sympathizer who was very high in the king's army. His name was Wyman Lacrosse and he was a first defender. He was killed shortly after a breakout from the prison camp he was in charge of." "Charlie's camp?" Grant asked. "Yes." Diana gave him a wan smile. "As Anton is so fond of saying, we all travel in small circles. After we freed the camps, the plan was for our main force to gather and attack the border, while a smaller force was sent through the transport to hit King's City. We hoped Charlie would be back by then." Her smile faded. "But things didn't go as planned." "So what happened?" Thomas asked. You couldn't take the border? We never even got the chance to try. We'd barely finished with the camps when the planes arrived. Diana shook her head. We miscalculated the extent of the King Richard's madness. We never dreamed he would drop his bombs on Kiloreen. Not when there were so many humans here. It was a mistake that bore a heavy price. So that's why you're in this cave, Thomas said. Yes. Grant's face had paled. How bad is it up there? Only 2 bombs were dropped. Diana stood and went to the largest map, which took up a sizable section of one wall. One here, she pointed at a spot not far from the edge of the map, and one here, she moved her finger to the center. This was the capital city of Kiloreen when the elves ruled. Even after the Long War, it remained a cultural center. The only place where the history and the arts of the elves was preserved. It was our most visited city. She let her arm drop back to her side. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 million people living there when the bomb was dropped. Not counting tourists. The number spun around in Thomas's head, and for the first time the full impact of what his father was doing hit him straight in the gut. 15 million, mostly humans, and his father had just obliterated them. Probably without a second thought. Thomas could be cruel and callous himself, but that was beyond anything he could even imagine. Nobody could have survived? Thomas asked. It's doubtful. We had a base of operations there, but we haven't been able to reach them. She gazed at the map. The bombs have a radius of 200 miles around the drop site. Even if anyone could have survived the initial blast, which is a near impossibility, they would have suffocated under the ton of diranium ash the bombs left behind. Between the two sites, we estimate around 30 million dead. 30 million. Grant moaned as he leaned over and pressed his forehead to the table. We're too late. No. The war is not over, Diana said, her voice firm. We still have a number of bases here in Kiloreen, and plenty of allies in Angland as well. We've been dealt a hard blow, but we're not backing down. If this has to be another long war, so be it. So long as a single branch of the resistance remains, we won't stop. Thomas felt sick. The idea they might at this very moment be sitting under a ton of diranium ash made his skin crawl. So where are we? In between the 2 drop sites, just outside Blyght, Diana said. The shock waves shattered windows all over the city, but so far as we know there weren't any casualties. However, after the bombings, all branches of the resistance were ordered underground as a safety precaution. We imagine King Richard thinks he's caught us, but we've just been waiting to see if Charlie would come back. Now that he has, maybe we have a chance to stop this madness before it goes any further. Thomas laughed. You mean you're betting the whole war on Charlie boy? He couldn't even keep his girlfriend and his pet sprite alive. How do you expect him to? The blow was so unexpected Thomas was on the floor before he even realized Grant had hit him. Get out, Grant said, looking at Thomas as if he were something unpleasant that had just crawled up out of the floor. Touching a hand to his jaw, Thomas pushed himself to his feet. Grant had never struck him before. Had never looked at him with such loathing. Without a word, Thomas turned and stalked out of the room. He went down among the tents. None of the elves paid much attention to him, except for a curious glance now and then. His jaw throbbed and his chest burned. But mostly his mind worked as he walked. 30 million people. Dead. Was this what Miranda had foreseen, that had made her do the things she'd done? Was this why she died? Grant thought so, and Thomas was beginning to believe it, too. He hated Charlie and he didn't like elves, but this went way beyond his personal feelings. And what if it hadn't been Kiloreen, which was for all intents and purposes part of Angland since the Long War, but another country? One with bombs of its own? He'd never spent much time thinking beyond himself and his own comfort and safety. War and death were distant things. They had nothing to do with him. Until they did. Now, he was smack in the middle of a war zone, and he didn't know what to do about it. He recalled once how Grant had told him he had to pick a side and stick to it. At the time he hadn't understood those words. Now he did. The only question was, which side did he want to be on? 24. Silence had followed the departure of the others. A silence during which most of the crowd melted away, to leave Charlie and Sylvan alone. Is there anything of Charlie still in there? Sylvan asked. Yes, Charlie said. Sort of. I don't feel anything, really. I recognize you. I remember my time in Kiloreen. I remember everything. But I can't feel the emotions tied to any of it. I'm subdued. I guess I would fall all to pieces if I wasn't. Sylvan smiled slightly. I'm glad to see you, Charlie. With or without the magic. You have been through much, I imagine, since last I saw you. You knew this would happen, didn't you? There was no accusation in the words. You knew the dragon would take control once we found the magic. I suspected something like this might happen, yes, Sylvan said carefully. I haven't the far sight to know the future, but when I was in your mind with the dragon I could sense the truth of it. I feared you might be lost entirely once it came forward, and perhaps I should have told you. But you are so young, Charlie, and there is so much more at stake than your life. I am sorry. No, don't be sorry. I can see things more clearly without emotions clouding my mind. Miranda told me I was meant for great things. I don't think she really knew how true that was. This is why I was born. I accept that. Whatever becomes of me after this is over, I accept that, too. What matters now is stopping King Richard, but... You can give the elves warrior magic? Sylvan asked. Yes. But only temporarily. I cannot bond them to the souls of dragons. That must come at birth. The true return of the warriors of old will have to wait until the next generation. Sylvan nodded. I understand. Warrior magic will help us on the ground, in hand-to-hand combat, but I fear it will be no match for the weapons of this time. Especially the planes that deliver the bombs. I had hoped there might be more the ancient magic could do. Charlie's eyes blazed red. Do you think there were no projectile weapons in days of old? No bows and arrows? No catapults? No engines of war? Thinking creatures have always found new and better ways to kill each other. Do you think there have never before been ways to rain fire and death from the sky? Let your army worry about the fight on the ground. I'll take care of the plains. Dragons have always been the lords of the sky. Time has not changed that. Forgive me, Sylvan said. I do not want you to think I doubt your power. But I am afraid and I see no shame in admitting it. Not for myself. I have lived a long life, longer than I have a right to, but for the world. Anton has shown me what the future holds if we do not win this war. Yes. He had shown it to Charlie as well, and it was no pretty sight. I think I know of a way to keep this war from dragging on. But it's risky and it could easily backfire. Any idea, no matter how risky, is worth consideration in a time such as this, Sylvan said. What is your idea? We need King Richard dead. It won't end the war, but it will throw the other side into chaos with no leader to guide them. There's only one person who might get so close to the king, Thomas. He could go in, claiming to know of a unified resistance attack on forces now occupying the remaining cities here in Kiloreen. You want to rally the resistance as we did when we attacked the mining camps? Sylvan asked. And you want to tell the king we intend to do it? Yes. Charlie said. It will allow for a distraction. Because while the king is focusing all his attention on Kiloreen, we'll send a large force of men through the transport in the junkyard to attack King City itself. King Richard will be blindsided. And if he's dead, all the better. Sylvan slowly nodded. It could work. Of course, it could also get a great many people killed. Do you really trust Thomas that much? No. That's why we won't tell him about the attack on King's City. There's too good a chance he would betray us. You could be sending him unawares to his death. I know, and if it weren't for the dragon, I probably couldn't do it. But it's the best way. Sometimes, in order to achieve a great victory, lives have to be sacrificed. King Richard must be stopped. You've seen the future. You know I'm right, Dot. Yes, I know, Sylvan said softly, a sad, faraway look in his eyes. We'll have to talk to the others, but it's a good plan. One I will stand behind. But suppose Thomas refuses? He won't. A half hour later, 10 of the 12 chairs in the conference room were occupied. Everyone listened quietly as Sylvan laid out the plan, excluding the part about King's City. It's risky, I know, but the sooner we end the war, the better for both sides. I do not hate the human soldiers. They are only doing as their king demands. I would not see more of them die than need be, and I certainly do not want another long war. But I would know what the rest of you have to say. In theory, it might sound like a good idea, Grant said. I kept hoping my father could be reasoned with. That he could be convinced to abdicate the throne. Now, after what's happened, I finally realize how foolish such a thought was. He looked down at his hands folded on the table. My father has to die. I agree with that much. And with the idea of ending the war as quickly as possible. My only problem is this entire thing hinges on trusting Thomas to do what he says he'll do. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Thomas said. Grant frowned. I'm sorry, but aside from the people you just met, is there anybody you've ever known that you haven't betrayed? Thomas glared at him. Well, who said I wanted to go on this mission anyway? Who said I wanted to play assassin? It's a stupid idea. I can't believe I'm saying this, Raven said. But I agree with Thomas. Letting him go to the king would be like putting our heads on the chopping block. Think of all the blood on his hands. Would you add more? I think it's a chance we have to take, Charlie said. Thomas has proven over and over he's not to be trusted. Grant said. Charlie, you know that better than any of us. He's unpredictable and he only ever acts in what he considers his best interest. He's already tried to kill you twice, and he turned me over to our father in the hope I would be executed so he could be crowned prince. We're his brothers and our lives mean nothing to him. I don't think anyone here has the faith in him to think it's worth the risk. He killed the only person who would have. Besides, you heard him. He doesn't want to do it, Dot. Thomas reacted as if Grant had struck him. He stared down at his lap, but not before Charlie saw the tears pool in his eyes. But he will, Charlie said. He'll do it because he killed Miranda. He has to finish what she started. He owes it to her. Thomas lifted his head and stared back at Charlie. That old hatred burned in his eyes, but there was also pain and sorrow and regret, and maybe that didn't mean Thomas could be trusted beyond a doubt, but it was enough for Charlie to think there was a good chance he would do what they needed him to do. He's a human, Jack said. He's the son of the king. Even his own brother says he's not trustworthy. Surely we can't seriously be considering this. Raven folded her arms across her chest. You would disagree with anything Charlie said, Jack scowled at her. You disagree, too. Because it's a stupid idea, not because I'm jealous. You've never liked Charlie. That's beside the point. Jack smacked a fist down on the table, putting a small dent in it. We can't trust a human to act in the best interest of the elves. This is not just about the elves. Anton's voice remained steady despite Jack's outburst. This is about the fate of the world. Now, perhaps this boy cannot be trusted under normal circumstances. I don't know. He looked to Grant. You say he will only act in his own best interest? What could be more in his interest than to stop his father from setting the world ablaze? He's a part of the world, as are we all. I agree with Charlie. The plan has risks, but it is a sound one. It could reap a great reward. Or bring disaster down on our heads. Jack looked around the table. Did it occur to any of you that as soon as he tells the king what we're up to, he'll send a plane to drop a bomb on our heads? I mean, the man blew up the largest military base he had in Kiloreen just to destroy the capital. He killed his own people. He won't hesitate to do the same thing here. That is why we are going to coordinate a simultaneous attack, Sylvan said. It will serve to confuse and strain his forces. Just as it did when we took out the mining camps. But we had surprise on our side then, Jack protested. This time, the king will know what to expect. We are at war, Micah said. We can't keep sitting on our hands, waiting to see what will happen. We have to take action. Diana nodded. I agree. Granted, there will likely be a high number of casualties even if this thing goes off successfully, but we never expected to win this war easily. If Charlie thinks it's the right thing to do, so do I. Pierce cleared his throat and nervously adjusted his glasses. I'm sorry to interrupt, but no one seems to have taken into account the fact that this would not be entirely risk-free on Thomas's part. He escaped the castle with us when we traveled to the City of Magic. Going back could be dangerous. He could be shot on sight, or worse, captured and turned over to the scientists again. At the mere mention of the scientists, Thomas paled. Charlie could see he was afraid. He'd once thought that was what drove Thomas most. That fear. He didn't think that anymore. If Miranda was here, she would agree with me, Charlie said. Everything she did, from the first moment when she talked to me on the bus to jumping in front of that bullet, was for this. She knew no sacrifice, not even her own life, was too great. He focused his gaze on Thomas. If she were here, she would have the words to make you believe what she believed. That there's more to you than anyone else can see. You went back for her when you could just as easily have run away. You're not a coward. If you were willing to risk death for her then, why aren't you willing to risk it for her now? Silence filled the room as everyone watched the two of them. Thomas seemed to be struggling for an answer. Perhaps struggling to make a choice in his own mind. Charlie sat, calm, assured of what his choice would be. All right, Thomas said. I'll do it. I'll kill the king. 25. Thomas rode out of the junkyard just after dawn, on a black and silver motorbike the elves had given him. It was 2 weeks after their return. It had taken that long to organize the rest of the resistance and get them ready to move. During that time, Thomas had kept to himself, as he had no friends in the camp and no desire to make any. When he did see the others, it was only at a distance. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of the morning, 2 elves had come to his tent to rouse him. They'd hurried him along to another area of the camp, a smaller chamber adjacent to the main one and heavily guarded. There had been several other elves there as well. But no Grant. No Charlie. He had thought they would be there to see him off. The elves had given him a motorbike powered by a red magestone and sent him into the transport. He'd taken no weapons, as the soldiers at the castle were bound to search him, and no one had told him exactly how he was supposed to kill his father. He supposed they thought he could figure it out on his own. Now, with the cool air blowing against his face and the sky just starting to lighten, he didn't want to think about it. For the first time in his life he was free. He could do anything he wanted to do. Go anywhere he wanted to go. Which begged the question, why was he riding this bike toward King City? For a bunch of people he hated? For a war he wanted nothing to do with? For a dead girl? Or maybe because there was a slight possibility his father might finally see the light. That he might finally realize who the better son was. He hadn't decided yet. Flat, empty land stretched out around him. The road was vacant. Ahead, King City was a hulking mass of buildings standing tall on the horizon, twinkling with a pale white light that grew paler as the sun rose higher into the sky. He'd lived there for the first 7 years of his life, until his mother died. She'd always told him when Grant became king they would all go to live at the castle together. A happy family fairy tale. She was a fool. Father had never wanted anything to do with him. It was always Grant. King City was a vast labyrinth of warehouses, shops, homes, and parks. Street signs cropped up like weeds, sure to confuse any who were unfamiliar with the city. The main street was already bustling with activity, even so early in the morning. Cars and trucks and motorbikes and buses, all crowded onto the road and often moving at a pace no faster than those on foot who packed the sidewalks. As Thomas moved along at a pace just faster than a crawl, he found himself wondering what it would be like if one of the diranium bombs was dropped right here. On King's City. There were surely as many people here as had been in the capital city in Kiloreen. Maybe more. How could his father live with so much death on his head? It was enough for Thomas to deal with just one. Well, 2, he couldn't forget Ezel, even if she was an elf. 3, if he counted the soldier he'd killed right here in the city. Though that was an accident. What about Mish? Thomas felt an oddly uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. He hadn't killed Mish himself, but the elf had died because of his treachery. Did that make him responsible? And if it did, what about all the people at the camp? Thomas had told his father where to find the camp, which had resulted in the deaths of about 100 people, most of them kids his age or younger. Kids he knew. Kids he had grown up with. He'd condemned them to death without a second thought, just as his father had done to those millions of people in Kiloreen. The scale was larger, but other than that, how different was it, really? The honk of a horn jerked Thomas out of his thoughts. He blinked as he looked around, then realized he had stopped the bike in the middle of the street and was holding up traffic. He started it back up, watched the Magestone spill its crimson light like blood across the sidewalk, then rode on. In the middle of King City stood a stone castle that looked like something right out of a storybook. Its medieval appearance was incongruous with its surroundings. Crenellated turrets topped with mounted machine guns, spired towers equipped with surveillance cameras and radio antennas, a lush green lawn surrounded by an electrified fence topped with barbed wire. Soldiers in gray uniforms, bearing machine guns and automatic rifles, patrolled the area. Thomas ditched the motorbike in a nearby alley and strode up to the front gate. He knew of no way to sneak into the castle, and that would go against his purposes anyway. However, he decided to play this. Whichever side he decided to walk on, he needed to get inside the castle. He needed to see his father. A soldier approached him on the side of the fence. "Halt! You must remain at least 50 feet from the fence at all times or you will be arrested." "I need to see the king," Thomas said. "I'm his son." The soldier frowned and looked him up and down, from his ratty sneakers to his unkempt hair. The clothes the elves had given Thomas were too big and not in the best of shape. He knew how he looked. Like just another street kid. One who either had some scam in mind or was a little off in the head. "The king doesn't have any sons," the soldier said, speaking slowly. "You're confused." Fact was, not everyone knew about him and Grant. They were a contingency plan in the event that Richard never produced any legitimate heirs. The only real proof they were the king's sons was locked away in the Great Library in Zardahan. Tell someone in charge Thomas is back and he has important information regarding the war. The king will want to see me. Or so he hoped. The soldier hesitated a moment, then touched a hand to the comm attached to the left shoulder of his uniform. "This is Soldier Ambierdine at the gate. There's a boy here claiming he's the king's son. Says he has some important information about the war." "Hold. A few tense moments passed as Thomas considered what he would do if they wouldn't let him in, or if the soldier was told to shoot him. Did he dare try to get into the man's mind and control him, as he had once done in the prison camp? He'd never tried it without the drugs, but after what happened in the tunnel he thought there might be more to what he could do on his own than he had ever known. Or maybe it was because of the drugs. He didn't know. But he supposed if the order came to shoot, it couldn't hurt to try. It wasn't like he could outrun a bullet. Let him in. Clearly surprised by this, Soldier Ambierdine spoke into his comb. Yes, ma'am. He waved to a little guardhouse off to the side, and a moment later the gate slid open with a low rumble. Go on up, Dot. Thomas crossed the carefully manicured lawn and walked up the steps to the massive stone door. Once he crossed the threshold, all resemblance to a castle of old vanished. Straight across from him a metallic, U-shaped desk was flanked by a bank of computer monitors. Above all hung a banner with the king's crest, the family coat of arms, a green shield studded with diamonds, a tiger on one side, a stallion on the other, with a jewel-encrusted sword point down between them. Soldiers in gray hurried here and there, their boots clanking against the tile floor. A small, blonde woman behind the desk stood at Thomas's. Approach. Welcome home, Prince Thomas. These men will escort you to His Majesty. She indicated two armed soldiers. He's most anxious to see you. I bet he is. With a jaunty smile that belied his fear, Thomas sauntered over to the two men. Hey guys, how's it going? Not surprisingly, they did not return his smile. Lift your arms and spread your legs. Thomas did as he was told, though it galled him to be searched like some common street trash. When they were satisfied he was unarmed, the two soldiers led Thomas over to an elevator. The door opened with a soft shush and they stepped inside. Thomas watched with some apprehension to see which button the soldier would push, as he was not certain it was really his father they were taking him to see, and was relieved when the man touched the one marked with a 2. The ride was brief, then they stepped out into a carpeted hall. A security camera on the wall swiveled toward them, and a moment later a voice came out of one of the guards' comms telling them to proceed. They passed a number of closed doors before turning down another hall and coming to a stop. There was a camera here as well, this one with a little red light on it. When the light turned green, the door before them slid sideways into the wall with a faint click. The study floor was carpeted in burgundy, the walls paneled in oak. A number of bookshelves lined one wall, while a large desk, backed by a stone fireplace, took up another. A flat-screen monitor was affixed to the wall above the mantel. At the moment it was blank. Next to the desk a floor-to-ceiling window looked out over an inner courtyard bright with flowers. At the window stood King Richard, a tall man with broad shoulders, whose dark hair was just starting to gray. He wore a neatly trimmed mustache and a gray silk suit, and he did not look at all insane. Richard gestured toward the soldiers. You may leave us. With a smart salute, the two men turned and strode out of the room. Richard's intense blue eyes focused on Thomas. I never expected to see you again after you helped your brother and that elf blood escape. That was nothing against you, father. Thomas smiled, though he could feel the hatred burning inside him. All he had ever tried to do was prove to this man that he was the better son. The one more deserving of the title of crowned prince, and what had he gotten for it? A man has to do whatever it takes to survive. You understand that. Richard clasped his hands behind his back. But now you've returned, and with information concerning the war. Or so you say. I would hear it. The elves are planning a coordinated attack on the remaining cities in Kiloreen, starting with Blyght. They'll be carrying out their plan in a matter of moments. Richard's expression gave no indication as to whether or not he believed this. And how did you come by this information? Before we escaped, I saved Charlie's life because I knew he was my only way out of the castle. He thought I did it for other reasons, so he tells me things. He's not too bright. How did you get here from Kiloreen? The border is uncrossable. Same way I left. Magic. Thomas could see now that his father was not stupid. He was wary, uncertain as to whether or not this was some kind of trick. Some kind of trap. Thomas knew he'd have to be careful, one slip would land him back upstairs. "Why have you come back?" This was probably the most important question his father could ask, and the easiest to answer. "I don't like elves and I hate Charlie. Besides, I figured by now you must see Grant as a lost cause and I want to be king someday." "I see." Richard stepped behind his desk. "And you expect me to simply take all this on nothing but your word?" "Find out for yourself," Thomas said. "Send word to Blyght. But if you wait, you may be too late to do anything about it. They have a dragon." For a moment, Richard just stared silently at Thomas. Then he leaned over and pushed a button on the comm unit on his desk. "Give me live feed from Blyght. "Yes, sir." "One moment." Richard turned slightly so he could look at the monitor on the wall while still keeping one eye on Thomas. A picture appeared, one showing a high view of a dark, brooding city. The streets and sidewalks were mostly empty. The few people in sight who weren't armed soldiers hurried about their business with guarded, uneasy expressions. "Everything looks perfectly normal," Richard said. "Perhaps you were." His voice trailed off as a fiery red dragon appeared on the monitor. Those in the street quickly scattered, even the soldiers. Thomas smiled. "Told you so." Scowling, Richard hit the button on the comm again. "I want loaded planes sent to every confirmed drop site in Kiloreen with orders to hold until my command. Now." "Yes, sir." Thomas stared at the screen as elves hit the street and spread out, most on foot but a few on motorbikes and even a group in a covered truck. At first, they had almost no resistance, as the soldiers were thrown completely off guard by the appearance of the dragon. Gradually, gray uniforms began to move out of the buildings and the fighting began. For a time, the elves dominated, moving with that spooky speed and grace Thomas had come to associate with Charlie. More soldiers came out to meet the resistance forces and soon gunfire, sounding oddly muted over the monitor, broke out on both sides. The dragon, meanwhile, continued to circle overhead, giving no apparent aid to those on the ground. A sharp whistling sound split the air as something new came into sight on the monitors. It was blurry at first, due to the speed at which it was going. It shot over Blyght, already slowing, turned around and came back. Now Thomas could see a sleek, silver plane, its outside dotted with small, white magestones so it shone with a harsh light. The red dragon moved into the plane's flight path, sending out a stream of fire to envelope it. The plane tipped sideways, dropping as close to the tall buildings as possible before righting itself. The fire burned out, leaving the plane scorched black in places, but otherwise unharmed. The plane angled upward, letting go a burst of automatic gunfire that peppered the dragon. Blood fell like rain. The plane ascended, the dragon fell. Thomas's breath caught. He might at this moment be seeing Charlie's death and he couldn't suppress his harsh joy at the idea. The dragon disappeared between the buildings as the plane righted itself and got ready to drop its load. Thomas's stomach tightened. In a blaze of fire, the red dragon hurtled through the sky. It crashed into the plane, knocking it sideways. With a deft flick of one talon claw, the dragon plucked the diranium bomb from under the plane, ripped its steel belly out, and kicked it away. The plane spun around and around crazily until it hit the ground outside the city and smashed into burning bits. A warm, red glow surrounded the bomb clutched in the dragon's claws. Then it was gone as if it had never been. The dragon swooped down to land on the edge of the very building where the camera was located. It looked straight into the lens with one amber eye. The monitor went blank. With a curse, Richard turned to his comm unit. "Switch screen to an overview of Kiloreen showing each of the planes. Tell them to drop their loads as soon as they're over the target." He looked back up at the monitor. "I'll turn the whole damn country into a crater. See if that puts a stop to their little rebellion." Thomas didn't see how it would be possible for Charlie to stop the destruction, even with the obviously advanced magic the dragon possessed. Perhaps he should already have killed his father. But with what? His bare hands. It might have been nice if someone had offered some advice. But he still wasn't even sure that was what he wanted. Let his father blow Kiloreen off the map. Then he would have no choice but to name Thomas Crown Prince. Only Grant would be dead. There was a time when the idea wouldn't have bothered him, but Miranda's death seemed to have knocked down some kind of wall in his mind, and now he was feeling things he'd never felt before. A grid map came up on the monitor, showing a dozen red dots spread out across the area and moving fast. Then one of the dots winked out. Richard muttered a curse under his breath. Thomas figured that meant one of the planes had been stopped. The red dragon wins again. He watched the screen in fascination as two more dots winked out, one after the other. How fast must Charlie be moving to catch up to those planes? Faster than the mind could fathom. Then one of the dots turned blue and Thomas felt an unexpected jolt. Charlie had been too late to stop that one. Did that mean he was dead? For a moment, the dots continued on unimpeded. Then two more went out. Another turned blue. The last 5 went out in rapid succession. Richard stared at the grid with a bewildered expression. No, he shook his head. It simply is not possible. A wailing alarm went off, making them both jump, and red lights began to flash. The comm unit on the desk crackled to life. Sir, we're under attack. The map on the monitor shifted to a view of the front courtyard just in time for them to see an army truck crash through the gate. Elves swarmed in behind it like a mound of ants roused in anger. Thomas stared at the screen, just as stunned as Richard was. No one had told him there was to be an attack on King's City. Why? A cold realization swept over him. He hadn't been sent here to kill his father, only to distract him. Thomas was more hurt than he would have thought he could be by such a betrayal. Did Grant know? Did Charlie? Was that why neither of them had come to see him before he left? Because they felt too guilty to face him, knowing they were sending him to his death? Richard stared at him as he slowly opened the top drawer of his desk. I never figured you to be the self-sacrificing sort. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a pistol. Thomas backed away. But there was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. No one was going to save him now. The bullet hit Thomas just below the ribs, sending a shockwave of white-hot pain crashing into his brain. He collapsed onto the soft carpet, no sound but the rush of blood in his ears. He had only one chance to live, a slim one, but one he was willing to take. He closed his eyes. In his mind, Thomas splashed through streams of blood as he tried to find the place where his consciousness opened into the ether. With Charlie there had been a window, but he thought he could get into his father's head without need of an invitation. Things around Thomas began to grow dim. He heard the beat of his heart like the steady thrum of a machine losing power. He ran through the deepening dark, focusing all his will, all his strength, on finding the way to free himself from his dying body. Up ahead was a canyon with only one way across. To jump. Thomas put on a burst of speed. In the real world he could never make such a leap, but this was not the real world. This was the world of the mind, where anything is possible. Thomas jumped. He sailed across the abyss, weightless as a feather, and hit the edge of the canyon on the other side. For a breathless moment he tottered on the brink of oblivion before managing to stagger forward. He opened his eyes. No, not his eyes, but Richard's, for he was looking down at himself. His motionless body lay in a pool of blood that slowly seeped into the carpet. He was dead. Or at least his body was dead. The rest of him was still alive. Still aware. He'd done it. He'd not only tethered apart himself to someone else, a feat he had accomplished several times before, but he'd actually severed his consciousness from his body and moved it into another. Richard was still here, but his mind had been unprepared for this kind of attack, and so he was easily subdued. At least for the moment. Eventually Richard would fight back, but Thomas thought he could handle that. His father was not really equipped to win such a battle. He could go on. He could live. Provided he could convince Grant it was really him and avoid being executed. It would be a constant struggle though. He would always have to be vigilant. Always work to keep Richard under his control. If he ever slipped, ever became lax, his father might find a way to retake control. After all, this was Richard's mind and he knew it better than Thomas ever could. If that ever happened, if Richard ever retook control, the first thing he would do would be to kill Grant and retake the throne. And Thomas didn't like that thought. He didn't want to see Grant dead. He didn't want to be stuck here in Richard's mind, a prisoner, feeling himself responsible for everything his father did. Thomas turned his father's body from the unpleasant sight before him and saw the pistol lying on the desk. The elves had betrayed him. Perhaps his brothers had as well. But he hadn't really come here for any of them, had he? No. He had come for Miranda. Because Charlie was right, he owed her. What would she do if she had ever found herself in this kind of situation? The answer to that seemed clear. He ignored the frantic voice of the woman on the comm unit, ignored the pounding on the study door, and picked up the pistol. It was much heavier than it looked and cold in his hand. He went over to the window and looked down at the flowered courtyard below. Then he pressed the barrel of the gun against the underside of his father's chin and pulled the trigger. 26. For 2 weeks after the assault on King's City, Charlie lay on a bed in the hospital ward of the castle. Whatever the dragon had done to suppress his emotions, it was no longer doing it. He felt everything, both physical and emotional. The drugs the doctors were giving him didn't help. The nightmares were so bad, he couldn't sleep. But he pretended to for the same reason he forced himself to eat, though everything tasted like ash in his mouth. To keep his friends happy. But it was okay. He wanted to feel. He wanted to be aware. Wanted to see and hear everything. Sometimes he cried, alone in the night, curled up in a ball with his hands pressed to the side of his head. And that was okay, too. Because he could close his eyes and see Miranda's face. He could bring up every memory of her, every feeling, and he wanted that. He needed it. No matter how it hurt. Raven came to visit him every day, keeping him up to date on what was going on. She told him about the deaths of Thomas, Diana, and Micah, about the king's apparent suicide, and about the destruction caused by the 2 bombs he had failed to stop. His plan had been a good one. They had won the war. But at such a terrible price. Jack had been badly wounded, though the doctors expected him to make a full recovery in time. Raven went to see him every day, too, and something in her eyes when she spoke of him spread a warm feeling through Charlie's heart. It would be nice if something came of it. He wanted Raven to be happy. Pierce and Peter came to see him often as well. They were staying in Pierce's old suite here in the castle. One of the first things Charlie had done, once he was well enough to talk, was to ask Pierce to look out for Peter. To take care of him so he would never have to live in another home again. He'd told Pierce if he would do that, he could consider any debts he owed paid in full. Pierce had agreed, and that was good. The two of them seemed to get along well with each other. Everybody kept telling Charlie how good he looked and talking of things they would do once he got better. In turn, Charlie would tell them how good he felt and how he couldn't wait to get up and about. But, perhaps with the exception of Peter, he didn't think any of them really believed that. No one had said as much, but Charlie knew the damage to his internal organs was beyond repair. No one could figure out how he had even managed to survive as long as he had, but Charlie knew. It was the dragon, giving him a chance to see this thing through as far to the end as he could go. Charlie wasn't sure just what he was waiting for, but he felt he'd know it when the time came. It came at the end of his second week in the hospital, when Raven, Pierce, and Peter all came together to see him, bringing a small monitor on a rolling cart with them. "Grant's about to speak," Raven said, pushing the cart up close to the bed. "We thought you'd want to hear." Charlie sat up, eager to hear Grant address the nation for the first time as its king. Grant had already told him it had been decided for the time being it would be best if the two countries remained one. Kiloreen would eventually be returned to the elves, but for now too much work remained to be done repairing the damage the bombs had caused for the elves to be thinking about setting up a government. Sylvan was already leader of the resistance and the elves looked up to and admired him, so there was little doubt as to who would rule Kiloreen when the time came. Raven turned on the monitor. It showed Grant standing on the front porch of the castle, looking every inch the king in a well-tailored gray suit. A far cry from the boy Charlie had grown up with. "People of Angland and Kiloreen, I speak to you now as your king. There has been much life lost in such a short period of time, and much has been destroyed. But the war is over and, out of the ashes of the past, we must strive to rebuild a brighter future. There will be many new laws made in the months to come and many old ones repealed. Today, I would like to tell you what my first 3 acts as your king will be. Acts I consider to be of the greatest importance. So you may see how things will be different now that my father no longer rules. My first act will be to abolish slavery. Not only of elves, but of all beings currently on the list of those not allowed to live freely in either country. We are all of us equal, and it is long past the time when we should be treated that way. Next, I will destroy all remaining stockpiles of diranium and end the mining of it. From here on out, diranium shall be an illegal substance and anyone found with it in their possession will be arrested. My third act as king will be to close the Great Library in Zardahan and destroy the records it contains. No longer will anyone be judged by those who came before them, but only on their own actions. This is the dawn of a new era, and the time has come for all of us to work together, as one people, regardless of race. It won't be easy. We cannot erase the sins of the past, nor should we want to. Better we should remember and learn from those mistakes so they are not repeated by future generations. Do not allow all the lives lost to be in vain. Let this be the beginning of a better world for us all. Thank you. The monitor went dark. He looks good on camera, Raven said. Sounds good, too. A little too idealistic maybe. He expects an awful lot. He'll be a good king, Charlie said, though he could not help but think of Miranda, who had this way about her. A way of turning people whatever direction she wanted them to go. If anybody could have changed the world, it would have been her. But Grant meant well and he would certainly do everything in his power to make things better. Charlie was only sorry he wouldn't be around to help, but he had been born for a purpose and he had fulfilled it. That was more than most people could ever hope for. Do you think you might feel like coming down to the garden tomorrow? Peter asked, looking up at Charlie. We could have a picnic. I bet even Grant would come. Sure. Charlie reached out and ruffled Peter's shaggy hair. I might even feel like throwing a ball around a little. Peter grinned. Really? That would be great. Come on. Pierce laid a hand on Peter's shoulder. We should let Charlie rest so he'll feel up to coming out tomorrow. Okay. Peter waved cheerily at Charlie. See you tomorrow. When they were gone, Charlie turned to Raven and saw tears in her eyes. It's okay, really. I'm okay. Everything is exactly the way it should be. Raven nodded, leaned over the bed, and kissed him on the cheek. Goodbye, Charlie. She turned and walked out of the room. He lay there in the bed as the day wore on into night. He kept hoping Grant would come, but he supposed some pressing business kept him away. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the castle. There were 2 cameras in his room and as he sat up and swung his legs over the edge of the bed, they continued to show exactly what the soldiers in the guardroom expected to see. Charlie, fast asleep. The machines continued to send out their steady rhythms, even after Charlie had unhooked all the wires from his body. The hallway outside his room was empty. He made his way through the castle, silent as a ghost. The cameras were unable to see him. An elevator took him to the top floor, and there he found a dark stairwell leading up to the roof. Nothing took note of his passing. The night was clear and bright, the velvet sky blanketed with stars, the moon a sideways smile above the sleeping city. Cold stone bit into Charlie's bare feet as he crossed the roof to the ledge. He climbed up, one hand resting on an old stone gargoyle as he gazed down. It was a long drop, but nothing he had to worry about. Charlie took a deep breath of the cool night air, gazed up at the stars, and felt a sense of easy calm come over him. With a faint smile on his lips, he closed his eyes and stepped off the ledge. With a flash of fire nobody saw, the red dragon opened its wings and soared into the night.